Morning in October of 2007, 30-year-old Brian Mock stood just inches away from his TV set, anxiously watching the Seattle Seahawks football team line up on the goal line about to run a play. His living room was filled with friends who'd come over to watch the game as well, and who were there to eat the eggs and bacon and biscuits and gravy that he'd cooked. On TV, the quarterback suddenly threw the ball to the wide receiver, but the pass was intercepted, and the living room erupted in boos and groans. Brian turned and kissed his 28-year-old wife, Beverly, anyway. Win or lose, Brian and Bev were still diehard Seahawk fans, and in fact were actually season ticket holders. And when the Seahawks were playing on the East Coast during away games like today, they would always invite their friends over for a breakfast watch party, because the games would start on the East Coast at 1 p.m. Eastern, and then on the West Coast where they were, that would be 10 a.m., hence the breakfast watch party. Brian and Bev loved hosting their friends. It was exactly what they had imagined doing when they bought this house a year earlier. The couple had gotten married about 18 months ago, and so they still were very much in their honeymoon phase. They lived in this modest ranch-style home with a nice front porch on the rural outskirts of Graham. They had 5 acres of land with breathtaking views of Mount Rainier out back. The neighborhood was sparsely populated. There was only one house close by with plenty of wide open space in between. Their closest neighbors lived in a trailer across a field behind their house. It was perfect for the couple. They were both very outdoorsy, not really cut out for typical office jobs and that kind of life. On their days off, they loved doing things like taking scenic rides on their motorcycles or kayaking in the Puget Sound. But no hobby trumped the pure joy of watching their beloved Seahawks play. The first half of the game came to an end, and Brian walked out of the living room and into the kitchen, where he topped off his cup of coffee. As he stood there drinking it, he noticed the kitchen trash was full, so he put his coffee down and grabbed the bag to take it outside. Brian walked to the bins out back and tossed the bag of trash inside, then turned to walk back into the house. As he did, he heard a car rumbling down the road. He looked up to see his neighbor, Daniel, sitting in the passenger seat, and the two men exchanged a quick wave. Daniel and his wife were the ones who lived in that trailer across the field, and like most of the residents around here, they enjoyed the quiet and mostly kept to themselves. But they were perfectly friendly. But just then, from inside the house, Brian heard somebody yelling angrily. Instantly, he knew it had to be his friend, Randy Holmes, and as he thought that, he felt a pit form in his stomach. Randy was clearly slurring his words, which was not out of character. He was only invited to this party because he was cousins with one of Brian's close friends. He could be okay, but he was young, just 21 years old, and a very heavy drinker. This was not the first time he'd come over and gotten belligerent. Bev also was not fond of Randy, and she and Brian also knew that Randy had actually been in trouble with the law before. They just didn't know the specifics. But Brian did still let him come over for parties, so as not to make things awkward with his cousin. So Brian picked up his pace and ran inside to see what was going on. In the living room, the mood was obviously tense. Randy was standing in the middle of the floor, yelling at no one in particular. Everybody else was giving him a wide berth, trying not to provoke him further. When Randy got like this, it was impossible to reason with him. Randy pointed at Brian's friend, Justin, and shouted drunk nonsense like he was deliberately trying to start a fight with him. Brian stepped forward, putting himself between Randy and the other party guests, and he told him to chill out, but that only set Randy off. Randy stumbled toward Brian, cursing and swaying on his unsteady feet until they were chest to chest. Then Randy shoved Brian. Not hard though, since he was too drunk to put any real power behind it. Besides, Brian was a big guy, and he wasn't exactly easily moved. In fact, if anything, the shove just sort of knocked Randy off balance. And Brian seized the opportunity to grab him by the arms and literally drag him across the living room to the front door. And when they got to the front door, Randy just kept on shouting, and Brian had to physically push him outside into the yard, and then he told Randy to just go home. Randy kept on cussing and yelling at Brian, but he also seemed to realize that he was physically outmatched here. He spit on the lawn, and then gathered himself and ambled back to his car. Brian watched him weave his way off the property and drive down the street toward his own home, music blasting out of his car windows. The moment Randy was out of sight, Brian exhaled, his body full of adrenaline. He'd seen Randy pretty bad, but never that combative before, and it sort of unnerved him. He shook his head, wondering what set Randy off in the first place. Brian turned and walked back inside. The second half was about to start, and he hoped the Seahawks would start playing a bit better and maybe take his mind off what had just happened. That evening, Bev felt exhausted as she and Brian picked up after the party. She didn't have the stamina to fully clean the whole house, but she at least wanted to get all the beer cans and booze bottles into a recycling bin, maybe do a few dishes before bed. She told Brian she'd put on some music while they tidied up, and then she went to go grab her phone, which she had left in the kitchen all day charging. But when she got to the charger was still plugged into the wall, but her phone was gone. She called for Brian, asking if he had seen it, but he leaned his head into the kitchen and said no, not since earlier, when it was charging right there on the counter. So he offered to help her find it. But as they began to tear apart the living room looking for her phone, a sinking feeling settled in Beverly's stomach. Randy had been in the kitchen a few minutes before his drunken outburst. Bev sighed and turned to Brian and asked him if Randy had used their bathroom while he was over. Brian shrugged and said, yeah, at least once or twice. He was here for a few hours. Bev sighed again. She was willing to bet that Randy very likely had been casing their new house while he wandered down the hallway to the toilet. Maybe he was taking things. She told Brian he better go check his hunting equipment. Then she ran into the bedroom and flipped open her jewelry box. And thankfully, nothing was missing. But Brian soon appeared in the doorway, very pale in the face, and said one of his guns was gone. And so now it became very clear that, Randy had probably taken the gun, taken her phone, and who knows what else. Bev asked if maybe they should just call the police. She was already scared of Randy, but now knowing that he very likely also stole from them, including a firearm, what's to say he wasn't planning to retaliate after Brian threw him out of their house? But Brian said no, we can't do that. Randy was a live wire. It was probably best not to confront him, especially not with police. Besides, everybody at the party was drinking. Maybe the gun and the phone were just misplaced. They should just finish cleaning the house in the morning, and very likely everything would turn up then. 6 weeks later, on the evening of Friday, November 16th, Brian packed up some of his hunting equipment so it'd be ready for the morning. Then he went to brush his teeth before bed. He had plans to go hunting before sunrise with his friend Justin White and wanted to get to bed early so he'd be well rested. Brian and Bev still hadn't found Bev's phone or Brian's gun that disappeared during that party. At this point, they were both certain that Randy had stolen both items, but they weren't sure how to get their stuff back without involving the police or making things awkward with Randy's cousin. So they had agreed to wait a bit longer and just see if Randy tried to return the items with some kind of flimsy excuse. In the meantime, Bev was okay without her phone and Brian had other guns. So Brian crawled into bed and soon his wife joined him. And in just a few minutes, they were both fast asleep. Around 5 a.m. the following morning, Brian's friend, Justin, pulled his SUV into Brian and Bev's driveway, ready to pick up Brian for a morning of hunting. However, the house was completely dark. Justin couldn't see any lights on inside. For a moment, Justin did just idle there in the driveway waiting, taking the last few swigs out of his tumbler of coffee. But he'd been up for a while already, so he was wide awake and pretty anxious to get to their hunting spot. He thought about going up to the door to knock, but he knew if he did that, he very likely would wake up Beverly, since, it was the weekend and it's 5 a.m., so she very likely was asleep. So instead, Justin just let his headlights shine in through the front windows, figuring that if Brian was awake by now, he would see the light and come outside. But after about 5 minutes of that, when still Brian had not come outside, Justin decided this was a lost cause, and he pulled out of the driveway. He figured his friend must still be asleep, so Justin decided he would go hunting alone that day. He drove to the woods on the outskirts of Graham, and as he did, he kept checking his phone. He figured Brian would wake up any second, feel bad, and ask him to turn around and come pick him up. But the call never came. And then when Justin actually got to the hunting spot and was walking around out in the woods, he kept checking his phone, but still there was nothing. And then once the sun began to creep over the tree line, Justin started to get worried. By this point, Brian definitely should have been up, and it was weird that he hadn't called Justin to at least apologize for missing the trip. Finally, after a few hours of unsuccessful hunting, Justin walked back to his car and just called Brian, but there was no answer. At this point, something in his gut told him to go back to Brian's house to check on his friend one more time. Justin pulled into Brian and Bev's driveway for the second time that morning, and it looked like the house had not changed at all. No lights were on, the cars were in the same spot, it was all the same. And so Justin hopped out of his SUV and headed to the porch to ring the doorbell. But when he got to the top step, He looked down and noticed that one of the wooden panels on the door looked like it had been kicked in. He hadn't noticed this earlier, but it had been dark out, so maybe he hadn't seen it. And then Justin heard something coming from inside the house. He peered through one of the windows into the living room, and he realized the noise was coming from their TV set. And he saw something else too. It sort of looked like a pile of blankets on the floor. This was strange. Bev and Brian were always very neat and tidy, and so it was unlike them to leave blankets strewn around. So Justin squinted, trying to get a better look, and as he did, he realized he was not looking at a pile of blankets. In a panic, Justin ran for the door and tried it, but it was locked, so he rushed to his SUV, grabbed his phone, and called 911. Moments later, a Pierce County Sheriff's Department deputy was driving through Graham in his patrol car when a call from dispatch came over the radio. They requested assistance for a possible injured person at a house on 70th Avenue East. This deputy happened to be in the area, so he said he would go check it out. It took him less than 10 minutes to get to the address. As he pulled up, he saw a man standing in the driveway next to an SUV rubbing his hands together. The man seemed very nervous and began to approach the deputy's car. The man introduced himself as Justin and began kind of stumbling over his words as he recounted that morning. He said he pulled up to the house and it was dark, and then he circled back after a fruitless hunting trip, and his voice shook when he explained what he saw when he came back, that he could actually see somebody lying on the floor inside the house. The deputy told Justin to stay put and not to follow him into the house. Then the deputy placed a hand on the holster of his gun and crept up the front stairs. He knocked on the front door, eyeing the broken wood panel that Justin had mentioned. When there was no response, the deputy pushed the door open and stepped inside the house. Immediately, he saw a long trail of blood that led from the front door into the living room. This was clearly way too much blood to just be somebody's simple injury. I mean, this very likely had to be a crime scene. The deputy grabbed his radio and called the sheriff's department for backup. Then he unholstered his gun and began moving slowly, following the blood trail into the living room. The trail led the deputy to a bloody sheet lying on the floor. An arm and a leg protruded from underneath the sheet. The deputy looked at the outline of the lumpy mass underneath the sheet and saw it was clearly too big to just be one person. He knew he was looking at two bodies, dead on the floor. Now, the deputy knew, obviously, this was going to command his attention at some point, but for now, he needed to search the house and make sure there wasn't anybody here, like the perpetrator or perpetrators. And so with his gun drawn, he searched the whole house. And when he was satisfied that the house was indeed empty, he made his way back to the driveway to wait for backup. He also wanted to get more information from Justin. However, when the deputy got outside, he was surprised to find that the driveway was empty. Justin White was gone. About 10 minutes later, Detective Sergeant Ben Benson pulled up outside of Brian and Beverly Mock's house. Benson was a 23-year veteran of the force and the lead investigator. He arrived on the scene with one of his team members, Detective Jason Tate. The two detectives climbed out of their car, and Benson gave Tate a very encouraging nod. Tate had just made detective a few months ago, and this would be his first major homicide case. Benson surveyed the neighborhood, or what he could see of it, given how dispersed it was. He told Tate to take a walk around to get the lay of the land, and then start trying to reach the victim's family. Tate nodded and headed down the street. Meanwhile, Benson headed up the driveway to Brian and Beverly's home. A police team was already making the perimeter of the house with yellow caution tape. Benson dipped under the tape, and a deputy came down the driveway to meet him. The deputy told him that he was the one who responded to the 911 call. He motioned to the open front door and said that Brian and Beverly Mock's bodies were inside. Benson headed for the door, and the deputy followed. He told Benson about the motion to the open front door and said that Brian and Beverly Mock's bodies were inside. Benson headed for the door, and the deputy followed. He told Benson about Justin White, the friend who had called 911 and then disappeared while the deputy was investigating the house. He said it just felt weird. Justin had seemed so concerned about his friend's well-being, but then didn't stick around to see if they were actually okay. Benson thanked the deputy. It was a good lead, one he had every intention of pursuing after he assessed the crime scene. Inside the house, a forensics team was already busy collecting evidence. Benson pulled on a pair of disposable gloves as he followed the trail of blood from the front door to the two bodies piled in the living room. There, he knelt down and lifted up the edge of the sheet that was covering them, and he was met with a grisly scene. Brian was face down on the ground, wearing jeans and a t-shirt. Bev was on top of him, but completely naked, and they had both clearly been shot repeatedly in the head. So it was no wonder the floor around the bodies was completely soaked in blood. There were pools of blood, smudges, and smears. It looked like someone did a poor job of trying to clean up. And when they couldn't sop up the mess, they just sort of covered the crime scene with a few blankets. Benson looked down at the trail of blood, which clearly had been created when the killer dragged Brian or Beverly from the front door into the living room. But the trail sort of looked strange. The blood was streaked with these long, thin lines. You couldn't imagine what had caused them. Benson moved around the living room looking for clues. Forensics had already found an imprint of a shoe in the pool of blood beneath the sheet, right by Brian's body. But otherwise, there were no footprints in the house. As Benson walked through the house, he began to notice blood smears in odd places, like on light switches, and there was a bloody smear on the door jamb leading into the bedroom. It looked like the killer tried to clean up the scene, but then ended up making a bigger mess in the process. And yet, for all the carnage, nothing else in the house was amiss. None of the drawers had been ripped from the dresser, the jewelry box looked untouched, there were plenty of valuables just lying around the house still. I mean, this clearly was not a burglary gone wrong. The killer had enough time to wander around and get blood smears everywhere, but apparently had no interest in stealing anything. Benson circled back to the living room, where forensics was still dusting and photographing the scene. He looked over at the kicked-in front door. The killer clearly was not let into the home, which meant they were either a stranger to Brian and Beverly, or someone they didn't want to let inside. All things considered, Benson's money was on the latter scenario. Someone that Brian and Beverly knew, but didn't trust, who showed up at their house, kicked down the door, and killed them. And given that Beverly was naked, Benson also had to consider the possibility that she was sexually assaulted as well. There was a lot of anger in this murder. It felt personal. But the question was, who wanted Brian and Bev dead? An hour later, Detective Benson pulled his car up to the house of Justin White. The house looked quiet, and Justin's SUV was in the driveway, so he appeared to be home. Benson walked up to the front door and knocked, and a moment later, Justin opened the door, looking pale. And his first question was, are Bev and Brian okay? Benson paused for a moment, and then told Justin that he likely already knew the answer to that question. Justin just sort of swallowed hard, but didn't respond. So Benson asked him why he fled the scene so quickly after the deputy arrived. Justin's voice trembled as he explained that he just couldn't stay there, not after what he'd seen or what he thought he'd seen on the floor inside the house. Brian was one of his best friends. He couldn't believe that something could happen to him. And then once the deputy showed up, it all just seemed too real. He just couldn't handle it, and so he panicked and drove off. He said he regretted leaving, but he just couldn't seem to turn the car around. Benson listened to this skeptically. On one hand, it was suspicious that Justin essentially fled the scene. But on the other hand, Benson knew that in high-stress situations, people did weird things, and sometimes they made themselves look really guilty out of just fear or panic. In Benson's experience, the best way to find the truth was to look for physical evidence that either corroborated or contradicted the stories they told. So, as Justin spoke, Benson scanned his hands and forearms, looking for any marks that maybe Brian or Beverly left. The crime scene he had just left was bloody and violent and brutal. The killer was very likely to show some signs of a fight. But Benson couldn't see any cuts or scratches on Justin. He wasn't sure what to think, but just to be safe, Benson told Justin he would likely have more questions for him in the coming days. By the time Benson got back to the Mock's home around noon, their quiet investigation had turned into a full-blown circus. The whole neighborhood was swarming with cops. Also, reporters from several local media outlets were stalking the street, asking for interviews with basically anyone who would give them the time of day. Benson did his best to dodge the journalists until he could duck under the yellow caution tape and retreat up the Mock's driveway. His partner, Detective Tate, was on the front porch to greet him, and he told Benson that he had just had a phone call with Beverly's mom, who supplied him with a viable suspect, a guy named Randy Holmes. Apparently, Brian and Bev thought that Randy stole a phone and a gun from their house about 6 weeks ago, the same day that Brian had to physically eject Randy from their party. Bev's mom said that she urged Beverly to go to the authorities, but the couple hadn't wanted to. But according to the mom, Randy always made Beverly nervous. To Benson, this all sounded like a motive. He told Tate, "Great work." That's when a uniformed officer approached Benson and Tate, saying that one of them needed to come talk with the neighbor who lived in the trailer at the edge of the Mock's property line. He apparently thought he saw something last night and wanted to help with the investigation. Tate knew that was his cue, and he told Benson he would call him with a report. Then he followed the officer across the field toward the trailer in question. Meanwhile, Benson headed back into the office. He wanted to learn whatever he could about Randy Holmes, including if he had a criminal record. It didn't take long for Benson to discover that not only did Randy have a record, but it was pretty extensive. Before the age of 21, Randy had been arrested for a litany of crimes, including possession of a stolen vehicle, forgery, and violating a restraining order. And that last one was of particular interest because it suggested that Randy could be capable of violence. Benson grabbed the phone on his desk and called Detective Tate. He told Tate that Randy was looking like a pretty good suspect, and he wanted to go and find him. Tate agreed and thought that was a good idea, and he also told Benson that he had some news too. He had just wrapped up an interview with Daniel and Jennifer Tavares, the husband and wife who lived in the trailer across the field from Brian and Beverly, and the couple said they didn't know the Mocks very well, but David said he did see something strange at the Mocks house that morning. Around 7 a.m., Daniel said he had heard gunshots outside. There were a lot of hunters in the area, so gunshots were sort of common this time of the year, but he said he was still curious, so when he heard them, he'd peeked out his blinds towards the Mock's house in time to see two men run out of Brian and Beverly's home, jump into a red pickup truck in the driveway, and peel out. Daniel said he did get a really good look at one of the two men. That guy had a ponytail that was tied back, and his face was pockmarked and scraggly, like he hadn't shaved in a couple of days. As for the second guy, Daniel said he really didn't get a good look at him, but he could see enough to know that it definitely was a man. And so after saying all this, Tate followed up and asked Benson, hey, does that description match Randy? Benson thought for a minute. The photo he had seen of Randy did not show Randy having long hair or a pockmarked face. But, Daniel didn't get a good look at the second guy, and so maybe the second guy could have been Randy. Either way, such a detailed description would definitely help them figure out if Randy was their guy or involved. Benson told Tate to wrap up what he was doing and head back to the station. They had a suspect to track down. About 40 minutes later, Benson and Tate pulled down a dark residential street in Graham, looking for what they hoped would be Randy's home. Randy had given multiple different addresses over the years during different arrests, so Tate and Benson were going to try all of them, starting with the most recent. They squinted out the windows looking for house numbers, and for a moment they thought they found his home, but then realized the number on that house had an extra digit. It took 2 more sweeps of the street for Benson and Tate to realize that, in fact, none of the house numbers on the street matched the address Randy had given his arresting officers. So either the booking officer had made a mistake, or Randy had given a fake address. Tate looked down at his notebook, where he'd scribbled all of Randy's known addresses. He wondered aloud how many of them would be phony. But Benson, he just sighed, and said this gave him even more reason to suspect Randy. Everything about this guy was sketchy. The second address on their list took them to a real house, which was promising. But when they knocked on the front door, a middle-aged woman answered. She admitted to being Randy's mom, but said she hadn't seen her son in days, and she had no idea where he was. She looked genuinely concerned as she asked if he was in some kind of trouble. Benson felt bad for her. It seemed like this was definitely not the first time cops had come around looking for her son. So he handed her his card and told her he just had a few questions for Randy about a case they were working on. Randy's mother took it and promised to call if her son showed up. Back in the car, Benson pulled on his seatbelt. Meanwhile, Tate crossed off Randy's mother's address and rattled off the next house to try. Under the circumstances, it was bad news that not even Randy's mom could find him, and so Benson just hoped that he and Tate would have better luck. He pulled his car down the street and headed west, winding his way through Graham. The third address took them all the way to the outskirts of town, where the streetlights disappeared and the road was suddenly full of potholes. Benson and Tate bounced their way down the uneven road, looking for Randy's house. Benson was beginning to think this was just another wild goose chase when he suddenly slammed on the brakes. The car skidded to a stop, kicking up a cloud of dirt, because there, right up ahead, was a smoldering pile of rubble where Randy's alleged third home used to be. But all that was left were the remains of a charred foundation. The house had been burnt to the ground, and recently too. Tate climbed out of the car and went to go walk the perimeter of the burned-down home. Benson just leaned on the hood of the car, scratching his head. He was starting to worry that Randy was on the run. By the time Benson and Tate got back to the station, the preliminary results from the medical examiner had arrived, and so Benson sat at his desk looking over the report, and the details of the murder were absolutely depraved. Both Brian and Bev had been shot in the head 3 times at close range with a .22 caliber revolver. But to Benson's surprise, the rape kit used for Beverly came back negative, which meant that she suffered no sexual assault either pre- or post-mortem, despite having been found nude. Benson also had a report from the forensics department, analyzing a palm print lifted from the blood smear on the bedroom door jamb, as well as the bloody shoe print they spotted by the bodies. They hadn't matched the palm print to anybody in the system yet, but they would run the prints against any that Benson collected from suspects, and so Benson really needed to find Randy Holmes. But before he could even start to formulate a new plan, Benson's phone rang. And when he answered, he was shocked, because the voice on the other line belonged to none other than his #1 suspect, Randy Holmes. Randy said his mom told him that Detective Benson was looking for him. She hadn't said what it was about, but he'd heard about the murders of Brian and Beverly, and he figured it had to be related. He said he was staying with a friend about 10 miles away and wanted to come in and clear his name. Randy swore he had an alibi for the night of the murder, along with several friends who could back up his story. Now, Benson had not been expecting this. So, pretty aggressively, he asked Randy for the names and phone numbers of these so-called friends because he was going to call each and every one of them and ask them questions about Randy's alibi. Benson was hoping that the way he was asking, being sort of aggressive on purpose, would maybe get Randy to flinch, or maybe refuse to give him contact information to show he was guilty. But Randy reacted by saying, "Yeah, that's fine, all good." And then he encouraged Benson to make those calls, call all of them. And so Benson scribbled down the information as Randy rattled off a handful of names. Then, Benson asked Randy point blank, did he steal a gun and a phone from the Mox house on the day of the football watch party? This was a test to see if Randy would lie. But Randy didn't hesitate. Yes, he said. Yes, he did. He said he knew all of this made him look horrible, but he swore he did not hurt Brian or Beverly. Trying hard not to be completely thrown off by Randy's apparent honesty, Benson asked for the address where Randy was currently staying. He told Randy he was going to send Tate over to check out the stolen gun, to see if it matched the weapon, gave him the address. He told him the gun was with him right now, and he'd be waiting for Detective Tate. Benson hung up and just sat there for a minute, absorbing this new twist. Then he stood up and walked across the room to Tate's desk. He handed over the address and asked him to go check it out. Then Benson got to work calling all of Randy's friends. An hour later, Benson sat dejectedly at his desk, sipping lukewarm coffee and skimming through his notes on the case so far. He just hung up with the last of Randy's friends, all of whom had confirmed that they were with Randy at a party on the night of the murder. Benson knew they could be lying to cover for their friend, but they all gave intricate details about the party, and all of those details matched. Their accounts were too nuanced and too overlapping to be lies. Benson had to reconcile the fact that Randy's whereabouts were accounted for during the murder. Just a few hours ago, he thought this case was basically solved. Now, he was back to square one. Just then, his phone rang. Benson answered and heard Tate's voice. He said he was at Randy's house and he had some more bad news. The stolen gun was not a match. Benson sighed and said, yep, he had a feeling that was going to be the case. Benson took another sip of coffee, and he began to sift through more documents in the case file. He grabbed the interview that Tate conducted with Brian and Beverly's neighbor, the guy who lived in the trailer across the field, Daniel Tavares, who had seen the two men running out of the Mox house. Benson wondered if he should go speak to Daniel again, just to see if maybe he remembered any other details that could help them crack the case. Or maybe Benson thought he should send Tate out to canvass again, this time asking neighbors if they recognized the man from Daniel's description, the guy with the ponytail and the pockmarked face. But whatever he decided to do, it was going to have to wait until tomorrow. This was only the first day of the investigation, and it was late. Benson and Tate both needed to go home and get some sleep. The next morning, on Sunday, Sergeant Benson climbed into the cockpit of a single-engine plane at the airstrip in Graham. He hoped that by flying over the Mox home, it could help him sort of reframe the evidence and show him what clues he could be missing. Benson glided through the blue skies, reviewing the details of the case in his mind over and over again. The door was kicked in, the victims' bodies were piled on top of one another and covered with a sheet. Their friend Justin was at the scene around the time of the murders, but claimed that everything seemed normal until he came back hours later. Randy Holmes technically had a motive, but no murder weapon and a decent alibi. And a neighbor saw two men running out of the Mock's home around 7 a.m., one with a pockmarked face and the ponytail. What was he missing? Benson finally reached the Mock's home and looked down from the cockpit. Even at this height, he could clearly see the yellow caution tape lining their property. Benson scanned all around the sparsely populated neighborhood below, quickly spotting Daniel Tavares' trailer parked across the field. He saw a trailer park even further down the road. Brian's friend Justin lived close, and Randy's mom's house wasn't that far away either. And as Benson was sort of staring around at all the places he had been on the ground with his partner, he noticed something he had totally overlooked while he was on the ground. He turned the plane around and headed right back to the airstrip. He now needed just one more piece of physical evidence and one more interview, and then he was certain he would be able to solve this case. Less than an hour later, Benson stood outside the sheriff's station as a squad car pulled up with his interview subject inside. Not because his subject was under arrest, they just didn't have a car, and so needed a ride to the station. It had just rained out, and Benson watched as his subject stepped out of the cruiser and splashed through puddles to the station door to meet him. Benson thanked his subject again for agreeing to talk, and then led them inside. While Benson walked with the subject deeper into the station to an interview room, Detective Tate passed by them on his way towards the front door. As Benson opened up the interview room door and he and his subject began to go inside, Detective Tate reached the front door, stopped, and bent down. By the time Benson was actually sitting down opposite his subject inside of that room, Tate, out near the front door, was standing back up and smiling. Based on evidence and interviews collected over the course of 2 days by the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, this is what authorities believe happened to Brian and Beverly Mock on the morning of November 17, 2007. The killer arrived at Brian and Beverly's house early in the morning, a .22 caliber revolver in hand. They were furious because they felt like Brian had disrespected them, and the killer did not let anyone disrespect them, not even their own mother. The killer walked up to the front door and knocked, but even though they could hear the TV on inside, nobody answered. So suddenly, in a rage, the killer just kicked in the door and stormed inside. From inside the house, Brian looked up in total shock, but the killer didn't hesitate. They raised their gun and fired. The first bullet struck Brian in the side of the head, and he crumpled to the ground. But the killer wasn't done. They walked over to Brian's body and fired 2 more shots directly into the back of Brian's head. The killer was about to leave, but they heard footsteps coming down the hallway. The killer looked up to see Beverly, completely naked, her face frozen in terror. She screamed and ran for the front door, but the killer fired 2 more shots, and both struck her in the back of the head. She fell. The killer stalked over to her, pressed the gun to her forehead, and pulled the trigger one more time. Then they dragged her lifeless body over to her husband's and stacked her right on top. It was only then that the killer looked around and saw the blood all over the house and realized what a mess they had made. They flicked on a few lights to see what they were doing, then went to the kitchen to find some cleaning supplies. The killer found a broom and tried their best to wipe up the blood on the floor with it, but it didn't do any good. It just smeared the blood around, creating these long, thin streaks across the blood trail that would later confuse detectives. The killer realized they had to get creative, so they went into the master bedroom looking for extra blankets. As they walked through the threshold, they grabbed the door jamb, leaving behind a bloody smear. Then they opened up the closet and found a spare sheet. They carried it back out to the living room and used it to cover Brian and Beverly's bodies. The killer turned off all the light switches they had turned on and then tried to wipe the blood off those switches, and then, feeling satisfied, they headed for the front door. But on their way, they stepped on the sheet, leaving behind a telltale shoe print of blood. Later that morning, a detective from the Pierce County Sheriff's Department would show up at the killer's front door, asking questions about Brian and Beverly Mock. But unbeknownst to any of the detectives, the killer had a dark and horrifying criminal past, and their many experiences with the police had turned them into a very good liar. So the killer was ready with a story. a story that the police would believe for a full 24 hours. That is, until Detective Benson flew his plane over the crime scene and realized that story was physically impossible. That flight, that discovery, would trigger one more interview, and the subject was the killer. And because it had just rained when they walked through the entryway of the police station to the interview room, the killer would leave a shoe print on the station floor that Detective Tate would find. And that print would match the bloody footprint found at the crime scene. The killer was Brian and Beverly Mock's neighbor, Daniel Tavares. From the air, Benson had realized that Daniel's story about seeing two men running out of the Mock's house was actually impossible, because from the air, he could clearly see that Daniel's home was simply too far away from the Mock's home to actually see that. And so as soon as Benson made this realization, he rushed to the police station and summoned Daniel in for an interview. He also ran Daniel's name through the computer system looking for a criminal record. And what he found would go on to shock the entire country. Because Daniel Tavares had been released from a prison in Massachusetts only a few months earlier after serving 16 years for stabbing his own mother to death. Daniel was not supposed to leave the state of Massachusetts, but he had, and he fled to Washington, and no one from Massachusetts had come to look for him. So Daniel was technically already on the run from the law when he murdered the Mocks. And yet, Daniel was so confident in his lie that when he went to the police station to be interviewed that last time, which would also be the day he would be arrested, he wore the same boots that he had on at the time of the murder. However, once Benson finally confronted Daniel with all the police knew, including the fact they had matched the print he had left in the station to the one at the crime scene, Daniel would confess to the murders. He claimed he had done it because Brian apparently owed him $50 and also had somehow disrespected him. Daniel was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. In the early evening of August 28, 2003, 83-year-old Eric Hingston was sitting up in bed trying to catch his breath in the small village of Plympton in the southwest of England. Eric's 81-year-old wife, Audrey, fluffed up a pillow behind him to make sure he was as comfortable as possible. She kissed her husband on the cheek, walked across the small upstairs bedroom, and opened up the window. A cool summer breeze blew in, and Eric instantly seemed to relax. For the past 3 years, Eric had been dealing with a series of health issues. He could only walk short distances with the help of 2 canes, he had heart problems, and he had a catheter. But despite these health issues, his wife, Audrey, had worked hard to give Eric as active a life as possible. And for years, together, they had managed to do just that. But recently, Eric had also begun to suffer from severe asthma, and so he struggled to breathe a lot of the time. He had tried different medicines and treatments, but sitting upright in his bed with the window open seemed to be the only thing that brought him any relief. Audrey turned from the window and looked back at her husband on the bed, and she smiled. She could see his breathing had started to slow down, and he had a calm look on his face now. Eric gave a little smile back to his wife, but it was obviously forced. He hated that he was stuck in bed so much of the time lately. It was just not how he'd imagined his life playing out. And a big reason for that was because Eric had spent the early part of his life in peak physical condition, facing dangers that most people couldn't even imagine. When he was a young man, he joined the Royal Air Force, and he had become a highly decorated World War II pilot who flew covert missions into occupied France. After leaving the military, he no longer risked his life on a regular basis, but he still pushed himself to work hard all the time and to accomplish any goals he set for himself. Eric got married to his first wife, they started a family, and he opened and ran a very successful neighborhood butcher shop that was located below the house where he still lived. And so for decades, Eric had been a highly respected war hero, business owner, and beloved member of the community. But now, he just felt like a burden. Eric's second wife, Audrey, sat down in a chair near the bed and took his hand. The two of them had gotten married later in life, when they were in their 60s, after both of their first spouses had passed away. Audrey knew Eric hated the situation he was in now, but she reminded him that they had shared almost 20 wonderful years together, and she wouldn't trade that for anything. Audrey asked Eric if he needed any more help, but he just said he just wanted to know how the butcher shop was doing. Audrey shook her head and sighed. One of Eric's sons now ran the family business, and he ran it well, but Eric just could never quite let the shop go. Audrey told him she was sure everything was just fine, but she told him she would head down to look into the shop just to check in on things. And so she patted Eric's hand, stood up, walked out of the bedroom, and down a flight of old wooden stairs, and stepped outside of the house. The street where Audrey and Eric lived in the suburban village of Plimpton had barely changed in decades. The butcher shop was connected to the house, but it had its own entrance, and right next door was a popular old neighborhood pub. Stone houses lined the little neighborhood, and Audrey could see the spires of St. Mary's Church, which dated back to the 1300s, rising up in the distance. Audrey walked just a few feet to the entrance of the butcher shop. A bell rang above the door as she stepped inside, and right away she saw Eric's son, James, standing behind the counter and slicing into a piece of meat for a customer. James waved at Audrey, and she walked over, and the two spoke for a few minutes. Eric's children and Audrey's own children had been adults when the couple first got together, so Audrey hadn't played any part in raising Eric's kids. But she'd always gotten along well with all of them, and she was thankful that James had dedicated himself to keeping the family shop up and running. A few more customers walked in, and so Audrey said she didn't want to get in the way of business, so she said goodbye to James and walked back outside. She smiled at a pair of young men who were heading into the pub next door, and she could see the street starting to come to life as people got off from work and headed out for the evening. Audrey took a breath. She missed the days when she and Eric would duck into the pub for a pint and end up talking to their friends for hours. Lives had changed since he'd gotten sick. Audrey walked upstairs to the bedroom and checked on her husband. He was still sitting up in bed, feeling the breeze on his face. He told her he felt like his breathing was much better, but he was feeling a bit tired, so he might just go to sleep. He asked Audrey to keep the light on, which she almost always did anyways, in case he needed to get up in the middle of the night. Then Eric gave his wife a kiss and closed his eyes. Audrey told him to sleep well. Then she walked to the bedroom door, but she stopped before she walked out. She could hear loud noises coming from the pub next door. She thought about closing the window to block the noise, but she knew Eric could sleep through loud sounds, and having the window open meant he got fresh air. So she left the window open, glanced back at her husband one more time, who was already falling asleep, and then she walked out of the room. At 3:45 a.m. on the following day, August 29th, so several hours after Eric had gone to sleep, Audrey was back in his bedroom, but this time she just stood there in the doorway, trembling. She looked at the open window and then down at the floor, and she felt confused and scared. She slowly walked across the room, picked up the phone on the bedside table, and took a deep breath. With her hands shaking, she dialed 999, the emergency number in the United Kingdom. Minutes after Audrey's call, police and paramedics sped down the small village street towards Audrey and Eric's house, their sirens waking up people all around the quiet neighborhood. Detective Inspector Tony Carney of the Devon and Cornwall Police parked on the street and followed several paramedics to Audrey and Eric's front door. Carney knocked on the door, and within seconds, Audrey answered. The sight of this small, frail-looking older woman in her bathrobe hit Carney hard. She looked terrified, and when Carney introduced himself to her, he could tell she was confused and struggling to put words together. Carney made sure the paramedics could get inside the house and head upstairs to the bedroom, but Carney stayed at the door with Audrey. Carney's first thought was that this poor woman should not be here while the police searched her house. She should be somewhere else where she felt safe and calm. Carney also knew he was dealing with a crime scene here, and he didn't want Audrey to accidentally touch or move potential evidence. So he asked her if there were any family members she might be able to stay with while the police were inside of her home. Audrey looked up at him and slowly nodded. She said her son was a retired police inspector and he lived not too far away. Carney signaled for another officer to come to the door, and he arranged for him to drive Audrey to her son's house. Once Carney felt sure that Audrey would be looked after, he put on his gloves, stepped inside the home, and walked upstairs to the bedroom. and when he got up there, he felt like he'd stumbled into a TV crime drama or something. Because on the floor of the bedroom, he saw all the paramedics gathered around Eric Hingston, who had clearly been dead when they got there. And Eric had been brutally stabbed in his collarbone. On several British TV shows, murders took place in small English villages every week. But in reality, murder cases in places like Plimpton were virtually unheard of. And specifically, the murder of an older man in his 80s like Eric was just really not something that ever happened anywhere near here. Carney glanced around the bedroom. All of the dresser drawers had been pulled open, and clothes covered most of the wooden floor. He looked over at the open window, and on the windowsill, he saw a black plastic bin liner, the British term for trash bag. He walked over to the window, looked in the bag, and saw several pieces of expensive jewelry inside. And something outside the window also caught his eye. Carney leaned out, and in the glow of a single outdoor light, he saw a metal ladder perched against the house just below the bedroom window. Just then, Carney heard someone calling his name. He leaned back inside from the window, turned, and saw a small team of forensics officers entering the bedroom. Carney asked the paramedics to clear out, and he gave the forensics team a few minutes to search the room without getting in their way. And soon, it was pretty clear that all the investigators and first responders believed the same thing. This had to have been a robbery gone bad. Someone must have climbed up the ladder into the bedroom, stolen some jewelry, and then Eric must have woken up, tried to stop them, so they killed him. But if that was the case, Carney wondered why the thief had left the jewelry behind. Did they just panic? Or did Audrey catch them in the act? The thief killed Eric, but maybe they just couldn't bring themselves to kill a woman who probably looked a lot like their grandmother. The forensics team continued their work in the bedroom, and Carney headed back downstairs and outside. Police officers had cordoned off the house with crime scene tape, and the neighbors had come out of their homes and had started to ask questions. Carney had worked cases in a number of other small villages, and he knew that even residents with the best intentions could end up slowing down an investigation. News about crimes in these small towns, especially a violent crime, spread fast and led to wild rumors and speculation and misinformation. And people would start calling the police, claiming they saw dangerous criminals on every street corner and in every pub. Carney walked back to his car and called into the station. He said he wanted a mobile command unit set up near the house, and he wanted officers on site whose sole purpose would be to answer questions from the community and provide as much transparency as possible. After that, Carney walked away from his car and informed the officers outside that they would have help soon. But before Carney could go back into the house, he saw another uniformed officer leading a middle-aged man towards him. The man looked almost as dazed as Audrey had. The man introduced himself as the victim's son, James, and he said he ran the family butcher shop connected to the house. A friend who lived nearby had called him to tell him what was going on, and James said he had spoken to the uniformed officer, so he already knew his dad was dead. Carney eyed James and then looked over at the shop. He wondered if it was too much of a coincidence that James worked at a butcher shop, presumably with knives, and his father was the murder victim who had been stabbed to death. James told Carney he still needed to call the rest of his family to let them know what had happened. Carney said he understood, however, before he left, he wanted to know if anyone who worked at the butcher shop, or anyone who might have worked there in the past, could possibly have had a grudge against his father. James shook his head and said no. He said police could talk to anyone who had ever worked for his dad, or anyone in the neighborhood for that matter, and they would all say they loved Eric, like family. Carney said how sorry he was again, and then told James he would follow up when he needed to, and then Carney walked back inside the house. Up in the bedroom, Carney found the forensics team combing over every inch of the floor and also bagging jewelry and clothing as potential evidence. One of the officers told Carney that they had pulled blood samples from Eric's body, but they hadn't found that much blood on the floors or the walls. They believed the stab wound had been deep enough to puncture Eric's lung and kill him, but it hadn't actually caused a lot of bleeding. The forensics officer said the puncture spot on Eric's body was deeper than it was wide, which most likely meant the blade was very, very sharp. The officer also said that they still had not found the murder weapon or any usable fingerprints in the room or outside of the window, but they would keep on looking. Carney hoped the team would eventually find usable prints, but he thought he might not even need them, because he believed there was a good chance Audrey had interrupted the robbery and gotten a good look at her husband's killer. On August 30th, so a day after the discovery of Eric's body, Carney and his partner, Neil Treby, knocked on the front door of a small house in a town not far from Plimpton. A man in his mid-50s answered. He told the investigators that he was Audrey's son, and that yes, he was a retired police detective sergeant. Carney and Treby felt lucky their potential main witness's son was a former cop. He could help them explain what was happening in the investigation to his mother, and also maybe make her feel safer and more comfortable when she was speaking to them. Audrey's son led them into the front room of the house, where Audrey was sitting on the couch. Somehow, she looked even smaller and more frail than the day before, when Carney had met her. But Audrey smiled and politely asked if the officers wanted a cup of tea or coffee. They thanked her, but they said they were fine for now, and then Audrey's son sat down next to his mother, and the investigators sat in chairs across from them. Carney said how sorry he was for her loss. He knew this must all be frightening and confusing. Audrey nodded, but she said she would not let fear or confusion get in the way of helping the police. And then, without any prompting, she said she had seen the men who killed her husband in the bedroom. Carney leaned in and asked if he'd heard her right. There was more than one killer? Audrey nodded and said there were 2 young men. Treby quickly asked if she knew these men, or if she could at least give a clear description of them. Audrey turned and looked at her son, and he told her she should tell them everything she knew. Audrey turned back to the investigators. She told them she had been sleeping in the guest bedroom, and she said she usually did that because Eric liked to keep the window open and the light on at night, which made it difficult for her to fall asleep. And so the other night, or early in the morning, she had woken up when she heard noise coming from the main bedroom where Eric was sleeping. It sounded like someone was groaning and something banging against the wall. Audrey said she figured it was just Eric trying to fumble for his canes to try to stand up and get out of bed, and so she got up and walked down the hall. And at this point, Audrey sort of trailed off. She seemed like she couldn't go on with her story. The investigators didn't want to push her, but her son gently encouraged her to keep going. And at some point, Audrey did begin talking again. She said when she got to the bedroom, her husband was lying on the floor, bleeding, and there were these 2 young men standing over him. One was holding a knife, and the other was holding a plastic bag. She screamed, and when she did, they ran for the window, climbed out, and disappeared. However, the one that had been holding the bag dropped the bag on the way out. But Audrey said before they escaped, she did get a good look at them. She said she didn't know their names, but she definitely recognized them from the village, and they were really distinct looking. She said one was kind of short, maybe 5'8", and the other was at least 6'1", and he wore bright white pants and a deerstalker hat, just like the one Sherlock Holmes wore. Carney glanced over at his partner. He didn't say anything, but a killer wearing bright pants and also wearing a Sherlock Holmes-style hat seemed really bizarre, sort of like he was on some fictional TV crime drama. Carney asked Audrey if she wouldn't mind giving a detailed description of these 2 men to a police sketch artist. He also said that he didn't want to pressure her, but if she was willing to go on TV and speak directly to the public about what these men looked like, it could be helpful. Audrey turned and spoke to her son for a few moments, and then after that, she turned back to the investigators and nodded her head. She agreed to do anything that would help get her justice for her husband and bring some closure for his kids. On September 4th, so 5 days after Eric's murder, Inspectors Carney and Treby stood next to Audrey in a large conference room filled with newspaper and television reporters. Police had already started to circulate the drawings of the suspects around town, but Plimpton was just one of several small villages that surrounded the much larger city of Plymouth, so the investigators believed getting the description out on television was key to reaching more people across the entire area. The investigators also believed if people just saw Audrey telling her tragic story, they might be more willing to help. Carney conveyed the basics of the case to the press, and then he introduced Audrey. She stood there for a second in silence, just staring out at the cameras pointed directly at her. She tried to keep her composure, and she spent a minute looking at some notes she had written down. Finally, in a soft voice, she thanked the community for all the love and support they had shown her and her family in the wake of this tragedy, and then she gave a detailed description of the two men she believed killed her husband. Afterward, Audrey stopped and looked down at the piece of paper shaking in her hands. She swallowed and closed her eyes, trying to fight back tears. After a few seconds, she opened her eyes, looked right into one of the cameras, and said very dramatically that there was no need for these men to have done this to Eric. Even if he had tried to fight them off, he was no threat to these two young men. They could have just pushed him aside and left with whatever they wanted. They didn't have to kill him. This press conference sparked an even bigger outpouring of sympathy for Audrey and the family, but it also led to a level of tension and fear that was totally foreign inside of Plimpton. People were now too scared to go out at night, and shopkeepers considered closing their doors early just in case these two murderous young men were out stalking their next victim. However, within just a few days, Audrey's press conference would prove to have been the right decision. On an afternoon in early September, Carney and Treby were working together in Carney's office when a uniformed police officer opened the door. He told them that two men had come to the station saying they needed to speak to the investigators who were handling the Eric Hingston murder case, because they said they were the men that Audrey had identified as being the killers. Inspectors Carney and Treby rushed through the station, and they found these two young men standing with several officers. And they did look exactly like the two young men Audrey had described. The inspectors felt a huge rush because it was like the solution to their case had just fallen right into their laps. Carney and Treby brought the two young men into an interview room, and Carney asked them flat out if they had come to turn themselves in for Eric's murder. But both young men immediately just shook their heads and said no. The taller of the two men said they'd seen Audrey's press conference, and they immediately knew she was describing them. But they had nothing to do with her husband's murder. Treby said if they knew immediately that they were the men Audrey was talking about, why had they waited several days to come in? The young men looked at each other for a second, and then the tall one kept talking for both of them. He said they were scared. Not only did they match Audrey's description, but they also thought people in the village would decide they were guilty right away no matter what they said, because they happened to live in a bail hostel in town. A bail hostel was a place where people who had been charged for crimes but had been released on bail could live if they didn't have a permanent residence of their own. Essentially, a bail hostel allowed law enforcement to know where they could find these people if they needed to until their case went to trial. Carney and Treby exchanged a look. They knew these young men were right. A lot of people in the village would assume they were dangerous criminals and decide they were guilty of murder regardless of the truth. But this didn't change the fact that Audrey had clearly described both of them, so Carney wanted to know how they could explain that, if they were not the men Audrey had seen in Eric's room. The shorter of the two men finally spoke up. He said he didn't mean any disrespect, but the old woman might just be confused. They had seen her that day, but not in her house. Instead, they had seen her when they were walking into a nearby pub. The taller man then quickly joined in and said after going to that pub, they went back to the bail hostel and stayed in all night. And they said the inspectors could speak to the people in charge of the hostel because the hostel had strict curfews and kept track of when people left and came back. Carney and Treby got the details of this bail hostel, then excused themselves and left the interview room. And immediately, Carney called the hostel, and the person who answered was able to confirm that both of those men were at the hostel at the time of Eric's murder. And so any rush of adrenaline the inspectors had felt when these two men came to the station had now quickly disappeared. Now, there was a chance that these young men could have snuck out of the hostel and made their way to Eric and Audrey's without anybody noticing, but that was not the most likely scenario, especially considering that these two men had literally sought out the police. And if Audrey really had seen them at the pub that day, there was a chance that in her shock and confusion, she had just remembered these two guys when she was trying to picture the men who were inside of her house. Carney and Treby returned to the interview room. They let the two young men go, but made it clear they would follow up with the bail hostel, so the men should make sure not to leave the village anytime soon. But once the young men were gone, Carney and Treby admitted that if Audrey had confused these two guys with the actual killers, the the investigation basically had nothing to go on. With 2 potential suspects off their list for the time being, Carney and Treby decided to head back to Eric and Audrey's neighborhood. At the mobile command center the police had set up near the house, the inspector spoke with shop owners, old family friends, and delivery drivers and paperboys who might have seen something while they were on their routes early in the morning when Eric was killed. But nobody seemed to have seen or heard anything unusual. And so with very little to go on, Carney and Treby couldn't help but keep coming back to the idea that their victim ran a butcher shop and he had been stabbed with what forensics officers believed was a very sharp blade, something that would be in a butcher shop. So maybe 2 men from the shop had broken into the house and killed Eric with a butcher knife. They most likely would have had easy access to the home, working so close. But when they spoke to Eric's son James and the few other people who worked at the shop, all of them appeared to have very strong alibis, so the inspectors could not directly tie any of them to the break-in or to Eric's murder. On September 11th, 2 weeks after the murder, Carney and Treby started to feel like the case was already slipping away from them. Their interactions in the community had not yielded any new evidence. Forensics officers had returned to the house, but still had not found any usable prints, and test results from the blood samples taken from Eric's body and the bedroom floor only matched Eric. And to make things even more bleak for the investigation, several people connected to the bail hostel had now officially corroborated the young men's alibi. So it seemed like the killer in the bright white pants with the Sherlock Holmes hat was really just a product of Audrey's fear and confusion. That day, while Carney and Treby continued to look for anything they might have missed in their case files, they suddenly got a call from a police officer in a nearby town. They put the call on speakerphone, and they could both tell right away that this officer sounded upset. He said he had been dispatched to Audrey's son's house because Audrey had attempted suicide by overdosing on pills. The officer said that paramedics had gotten Audrey to the hospital fast enough to save her life, but he also said he had found a suicide note on site, and the note read, "Please catch the terrible people who ruined my life. I cannot live without Eric." As soon as Carney and Treby hung up, a sense of guilt hit both of them. They knew their investigation had not really been going on that long, but the fact that they still had not found the killers had clearly taken a toll on Audrey. Carney and Treby left the station and headed right to the hospital to check on Audrey in person. When they arrived, they learned that Audrey was okay, however, for now, she just needed to rest and recover on her own. So the inspectors, instead of speaking to Audrey, spoke briefly with a social worker who had met with Audrey when she was first brought into the hospital. And after this conversation, the inspectors decided they needed to start from scratch. There had to be something inside of Audrey and Eric's house that they and their team had simply missed, and they had to make sure they found it before anything like the suicide attempt happened again. Not long after this hospital visit, Carney and Treby led their investigative team back to Audrey and Eric's house. And this time, they wanted to recreate the robbery and murder as best as they could, hoping this might lead to hidden fingerprints or some new idea about what could have happened. They started by having 2 police officers place the ladder outside against the house, scale it, and then try to climb into the bedroom window. And what they discovered is because of the way the window was designed and where it was situated in the house, it meant that somebody would have to awkwardly stretch up from the ladder, grab onto a small piece of cement, and pull themselves up and over the windowsill and into the bedroom. This proved to be so difficult that even the youngest, most fit cop on the team couldn't do it. And so the only other option for the killers, assuming they were using this ladder, would have been to use the ladder to climb onto the roof of the house and then scale down from the roof and sort of swing themselves into the bedroom. And this scenario, much like the first one, required a lot of strength and to some degree a level of fearlessness because the risk of falling was quite high. And even with all that, it still would have been really hard to pull off. So police wondered if maybe the killers had somehow practiced this maneuver beforehand. After the investigative team tried several more times to run through various ladder scenarios, they headed back inside the house to do another complete search. Now, Carney and Treby had no idea if during this search they would find anything new. The house had already been searched on 3 separate occasions. But they still encouraged their team to literally look everywhere in this house, even in places where it didn't even seem possible that a clue could turn up. And after another lengthy search, when Carney and Treby had both become convinced that they were going to come up short again, they heard an officer shouting their name. Carney and Treby ran through the house. In the kitchen, they saw an officer standing by an open drawer with his back to them. Carney asked what was going on, and the officer said he'd found something that was stuck in the small space between the drawer and the counter the drawer was in. Carney and Treby just stood there with bated breath as this officer jimmied the drawer to try to free what was stuck there. And then finally, the officer got it free, and he turned around, and in a gloved hand, he showed them what was stuck. It was a knife with a red handle and a sharp 7-inch blade. It was the type of knife that would most likely be used by a chef or a butcher. That knife was immediately sent to the crime lab for testing, and when the results from those tests came back, it only confirmed what Carney and Treby already knew. This knife had cracked Eric's murder case. Based on test results from the crime lab, forensic evidence, and interviews conducted during the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Hingston. In the early morning hours of August 29, 2003, the killer dragged a tall metal ladder from Eric and Audrey's back garden to the side of the house. It was dark, except for a couple of house lights on the street, and the neighborhood was completely quiet. The killer placed the ladder against the house beneath the bedroom window, and as they placed it there, the metal of the ladder clanged against the concrete of the house, and the killer froze. They looked around nervously, but there were no signs that the noise they had just made had attracted any attention. So after that, the killer, instead of walking up the ladder, walked around to the front door of the house and went inside. And they headed up the stairs, holding a sharp 7-inch blade in one hand and a plastic bin liner in the other. Each step they took on the staircase made the house creak, so the killer moved slowly, trying to make as little noise as possible. The killer reached the top of the stairs, walked down a short hallway, and entered the bedroom where Eric was sleeping. The light was on, and the killer saw Eric sitting up in his bed. However, he was fast asleep. The killer placed the plastic bag down on the floor, then took a breath, gripped the knife tight, and walked across the room. They stood over the side of the bed, staring down at Eric. Then they raised the knife up and slammed it down into Eric's collarbone. Eric woke up, wheezing and trying to scream. Blood began running down his shirt, and he used all of his strength to pull himself up out of bed, but as soon as he was up, he just collapsed and fell to the floor. The killer just stood there, watching Eric as his breathing got slower and more strained until Eric went still. He had died. The killer then walked to the dresser, opened up the drawers, and began tossing articles of clothing all over the floor. When they had almost emptied the dresser, they stopped, went over and grabbed their bin liner, and then walked over to a jewelry box that was sitting on the bedroom vanity, and they dumped most of the jewelry that was inside of it into the liner. The killer carried the now full bag across the room and placed it on the windowsill. Then they looked outside through the open window to make sure the ladder was still in place, and it was. Satisfied, the killer left the bedroom, went downstairs, but instead of going outside, they went into the kitchen, and they calmly hid the murder weapon in the space between a kitchen drawer and the counter. After that, the killer walked to the front room, sat down on the couch, and waited almost 2 hours before they called the police to report a robbery and a murder that had taken place inside of their own home. "81-year-old Audrey Hingston had murdered her husband." It turned out that Audrey had grown tired of having to take care of Eric full-time. She missed her old life of going out, visiting the pub, and spending time with her friends. Over the years, Eric's health issues had started to make her feel completely trapped, so she came up with a plan to kill him and make it look like a robbery. Audrey went as far as to pick the 2 young men she would pin the murder on. She often saw these 2 young men walking around the neighborhood and visiting the pub, then she knew they lived in the bail hostel, so she thought they would look guilty. But even after these suspects that Audrey identified came to police and provided strong alibis, Carney and Treby didn't turn their attention to Audrey and think she was guilty. Instead, they truly believed that Audrey had just been confused, and that she really had seen two young men robbing her house and killing her husband, just not these two young men. However, following Audrey's suicide attempt, the inspectors met with a social worker who'd been speaking to Audrey. And the social worker said it was so strange, but despite what Audrey's notes said about the reason she had attempted suicide was because of her grief over her husband's death, that this social worker's experience with Audrey had been that Audrey had almost no grief or sadness about her husband being dead. And so after hearing this, the inspectors did not immediately believe this 81-year-old woman was a murderer, but they thought she might not be telling them the whole truth about what had happened. And so it was at that point that they tried to recreate the break-in using the ladder outside to get a better idea of what Audrey might have witnessed. But the inspectors quickly discovered that it would have been incredibly difficult, if not downright impossible, to pull off the break-in using the ladder. So when police found the knife hidden in the kitchen, they felt confident that there had not even been a robbery at all, that nobody had used the ladder to break in, and that instead, very likely, someone close to Eric had simply entered his house through the front door and killed him. Now, at this point, the inspectors suspected that either Eric's son, James, or maybe one of the other workers at the butcher shop were the killer. However, the only DNA found on that knife discovered in the kitchen was Audrey's. The inspectors had followed up with James, and when he heard about this knife that was found in the kitchen, he was in complete shock, because he said just a week before the murder, Audrey had come into the butcher shop and asked him to sharpen that specific knife. After Carney and Treby confronted Audrey with all of this evidence, her son, who was the former policeman, was sure his mother had killed Eric, and he convinced her to confess. At the time, Audrey became one of the oldest women in British history to be jailed for murder. But because of the circumstances and her age, she actually only served 7 months in prison. After her release, she was banned from returning to Plimpton or contacting Eric's family for several years. Audrey died in 2016. A quick note about our stories. They are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen Podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel. 26th, 2007, a 68-year-old woman named Sarah Dixon sat at her kitchen table inside of her home in Burlington, North Carolina. Sitting next to her was her close friend, Brenda Clapp, and the two of them were flipping through Sarah's recipe book. So, Burlington was a small religious town where everybody seemed to know everybody, and Sarah lived on a huge 41-acre plot of land on the outskirts of town. She had known Brenda for over 4 decades, mostly from working together at their local Bank of America. Sarah herself had worked there for 42 years, and the people of Burlington had come to depend on her to handle their finances, which was how she got her nickname, the Bank Lady. But Sarah and Brenda were both retired now, so they did simpler things these days, like swap recipes. Sarah turned a page inside of her recipe book, looking for her apple dumpling recipe to give to Brenda. She wanted to share it because it was a perfect holiday dish, and Christmas was coming up fast. But even though the holidays were right around the corner, Sarah had not had time to decorate. She had a busy schedule between spending time with her family and also volunteering around town. Sarah actually had so much to do in her retirement that she still kept a planner, where she wrote all her to-do lists and crossed tasks off as soon as she finished them. And she was in the middle of one of those tasks right now, which was give Brenda a recipe. Sarah finally found the apple dumpling recipe, so she carefully pulled it out of the book and handed the page to Brenda, being careful not to crumple it up. It was important to Sarah to keep her house and her belongings very neat and tidy. She took a lot of pride in being put together, because that's what she felt like her community expected from her. She was Sarah Dixon, the sweet, friendly bank lady, the woman who had everything all together. But there was a lot going on in Sarah's life that her neighbors and acquaintances and the community just didn't see. In fact, that particular day, she had something heavy weighing on her, and she'd been waiting for the right moment to bring it up to Brenda. As Brenda put the recipe in her bag and got up from the table to leave, Sarah suddenly asked Brenda to wait. Then, Sarah told her that she needed a very big favor. Brenda was a bit surprised and asked Sarah, what do you need? And Sarah walked over to a drawer in the kitchen, took out a piece of paper, and asked Brenda to read it and then sign it. Brenda furrowed her brow but walked over and took the paper, then sat down and began to read it. And as she did, her expression went from curious to surprised to really serious. And then when she was done, she asked Sarah if she was sure about this. And Sarah's only response was yes. She didn't want to explain why. It was just important to her and she had made up her mind. Brenda could tell Sarah was sure, but she was still confused. However, she didn't ask any more questions. She just signed the paper. Then Brenda got up and left, and Sarah crossed off give Brenda recipe in her daily planner. A few days later, on Wednesday, November 28th, Sarah walked out her front door and then down her walkway, which was lined with neatly pruned shrubs. She was on her way to do something that she did fairly often, which was visit a local nursing home. She hopped in her car and began driving through town. And as she did, she saw that everybody was out getting a jump on decorating for Christmas. Her neighbors had trees on display in their windows, and then when she got to Main Street, it was all lit up with twinkling lights and wreaths. When Sarah finally got to the nursing home, she parked, went inside, and then checked in with the nurses like she always did. Then she headed down a hallway and into the same room that she always went to. And in that room was her husband of 20 years, a man named Cardwell Dixon. So 3 years ago, Cardwell had suffered a series of strokes that left him with limited mobility and dementia. And so Sarah had been forced to put him in a nursing home since he needed around-the-clock medical care. But even though Cardwell now had a whole medical team, Sarah was still really involved in his care. She was his guardian, which meant she was in charge of his day-to-day life, and she also had regular contact with the lawyer who oversaw Cardwell's estate and controlled most of his finances. In public, Sarah tried to look like she was handling all this stuff with her husband very easily. But the truth was, Cardwell's health problems had really upended her. She felt lost and sort of alone without her husband the way he used to be. She did have other family members that lived nearby, which helped a little. She and Cardwell both had kids from previous marriages. Sarah had a son named Mike who was in his late 40s. She was also a stepmom to Cardwell's children, 52-year-old Alan and 43-year-old Dennis. Even though Cardwell's kids were adults by the time she and Cardwell had gotten married, Sarah had worked really hard to be a true mother to his two kids and sort of make them feel like they were all one big family. And she felt like she had been successful in doing that. Now, she was also a doting grandmother to all three of the boys' kids. Mike lived close by in Burlington with his wife and kids. Dennis and his family lived just 2 doors down from her. And Alan and his 2 daughters did live further away in Virginia, but Sarah stayed in touch with them as much as she could. Still, despite having a lot of her family nearby, there was a lot Sarah had to deal with by herself. Like, for example, her and Cardwell's finances. The nursing home was really expensive, to the point that Sarah actually could not keep up with the bills. So, she'd recently spoken to the lawyer who oversaw Cardwell's estate, and together, they had decided to sell the entire 41-acre property where she lived to continue financing Cardwell's stay at the nursing home. Sarah had been very open with Cardwell that she was doing this, but she didn't really know if he understood her. He could barely speak or really even acknowledge her anymore. But he was still her husband. So, that evening, Sarah helped him eat his dinner, and also told him about another major change she decided to make recently. As she spooned food into Cardwell's mouth, she explained that her good friend Brenda had recently stopped by, and Brenda had agreed to do her a huge favor. Brenda had agreed to take over as Sarah's power of attorney, and so that paper she had signed the other day made everything legally official. This meant that if Sarah ever found herself in a position like Cardwell, where she couldn't make personal or financial decisions for herself, Brenda would be able to do it for her. And this was a big deal, because the only way Brenda could actually take over this role of being the power of attorney was if Sarah took that power away from the person who already had it. And that was her biological son, Mike. Now, Sarah loved and respected her son, but over the past few months, there'd been a lot of tension between them, mostly because Sarah didn't get along with Mike's wife. So removing Mike as her power of attorney was just something she felt like she had to do to protect herself and Cardwell. Sarah said all of this to Cardwell, and she wanted to hear him tell her that she was making the right decision. But unfortunately, her husband's expression remained totally blank. Sarah sighed and finished helping him eat his dinner. Eventually, she said she would see him tomorrow, and then she left and drove back home. When she got there, she parked in the driveway, went inside, and took her shoes off at the door. She immediately noticed that the housekeeper had been there while she was out, because the carpets were freshly vacuumed. She went to her bedroom, got in her pajamas, and then climbed into bed. And as she drifted off to sleep, she took one last look at the baby crib at the foot of the bed. It belonged to her biological grandson, Mike's youngest child. And every time she was babysitting, that's where he would sleep. Even though Sarah knew there was real tension right now between her and Mike, she hoped that soon they could resolve it, which would give her more opportunities to play grandma. By the time Sarah had finally fallen asleep, the house and everything outside was quiet, except for one car that pulled down the street and came to a stop right outside of her house. Two days later, on the evening of November 30th, one of Sarah's neighbors drove past her house and noticed something that made them stop. There were a few newspapers piled up at the end of Sarah's driveway. This was unusual because the neighbor knew that Sarah was normally very much on top of things like that. When the neighbor thought about it, they realized they actually hadn't seen Sarah in a couple of days. Her car was in the driveway, so she wasn't on vacation, but she was typically a very social person who was in and out of the house a lot, so she was someone that was seen by neighbors quite a bit. So, sensing something could be off here, this neighbor decided to go knock on Sarah's door, just to make sure she was okay. But when they knocked, no one answered. Eventually, they called out Sarah's name, but they didn't get a response. At this point, the neighbor officially had a bad feeling, so they reached out, turned the doorknob, and went inside. Once inside the house, the neighbor called out for Sarah again, but there was still no answer, so they went right and headed down the hallway that led to the bedrooms. But when the neighbor passed the den across the hall from Sarah's room, they stopped. Because unlike the rest of Sarah's very clean house, the den was a disaster. Furniture was overturned, drawers were pulled out of dressers, and their contents were spilled all over the ground. The neighbor knew immediately Sarah didn't do this. Something bad had happened here. The neighbor was having a hard time staying calm, but they forced themselves to still turn around and head towards Sarah's room and just look inside to make sure she was okay. And when they did, they saw Sarah, and she was lying in her bed. But she was covered by a colorful blanket with only a little bit of her hair poking out. The neighbor walked a couple steps closer and realized Sarah was not moving. At that point, the neighbor ran out of the room and called 911. Very soon after this 911 call, a responding officer arrived at Sarah's house to do an initial wellness check. And when he got there, he went inside of Sarah's house, down the hallway, past the destroyed den, and into Sarah's bedroom. And he saw Sarah was covered by a brightly colored blanket. He walked over and just barely lifted up one corner of the blanket that covered up her face, and immediately he could tell Sarah was dead. But he knew she had not had a stroke like the 911 caller had suggested, because clearly he could see that Sarah had been shot in the head. The responding officer called for backup, and soon after, homicide investigators and other personnel arrived to process the scene. Among them were an investigator named Curtis Morris and the county sheriff, whose name was Terry Johnson. There weren't a lot of murder cases in Burlington, North Carolina, so when there was one, the sheriff got called. Investigator Morris and Sheriff Johnson walked through the house to Sarah's bedroom, where crime scene techs were already collecting evidence and taking photos. Sarah was still covered by that brightly colored blanket, which Morris noticed did not match the rest of her covers. It had a bright cartoon print on it, and so it seemed like an unusual item for an adult woman to use, and it was also placed on her in a way that it seemed like Sarah had been tucked in, like the sides and the bottom of the blanket had sort of been neatly tucked around her. To Morris, this meant that somebody else must have put this blanket on Sarah, possibly her killer. Police were not yet sure how long she had been dead for, but Morris guessed that when she was killed, she likely had to have been sleeping, since there was no sign of a struggle in the room. The whole space appeared very neat and tidy. In fact, Morris could see fresh vacuum marks on the carpet, which meant he could also see in the carpet what looked like shoe prints leading from the foot of Sarah's bed out of the room. He and Sheriff Johnson followed those footprints through the house and to the back door, which was wide open. The side of the door was actually splintered, like it had been kicked in. This told Morris that this must have been the point of entry for whoever had killed Sarah. He was about to leave it to the crime techs to take some photos, but as he was turning away, something glinted in the beam of his flashlight and caught his eye. Morris looked closer and realized it was a single piece of tinsel. The investigators had seen enough of Sarah's house by this point to know that she didn't have any Christmas decorations up yet. So whoever broke this door open likely brought the tinsel in with them without knowing it. Morris asked the crime scene techs to photograph the tinsel and make sure to put it in an evidence bag. Morris continued looking around the house, and just like Sarah's neighbor, he noted that the den across from Sarah's bedroom was a total mess. His first thought was that it looked like the room had been burglarized. But when he looked closer, he found there were still valuable items around, like electronics. There was also a lot of cash and jewelry inside of Sarah's room right across the hall. Everything Morris saw so far suggested this murder was not actually a robbery gone wrong, but rather it was a murder that had been staged to look like a robbery. To Morris, it seemed very likely at this point that this was a premeditated and very personal homicide. He hadn't seen a murder weapon, which probably meant that the killer had brought it to Sarah's house and then taken it when they'd left. It also seemed like they must have known Sarah's sleeping habits, at least generally, since she was likely fast asleep when she was killed. Then there was the colorful blanket, which was arranged on top of Sarah as if somebody else had placed it there and sort of tucked her in. Now, if the killer had tucked her in, that act of tucking somebody in is sort of inherently caring, like you're kind of neatly making sure they're comfortable, even though they have just killed her. It's like this very conflicted way of thinking, that perhaps the killer was remorseful or emotional after having killed her, and so they tucked her in as sort of tucked her in. Now, if the killer had tucked her in, that act of tucking somebody in is sort of inherently caring, like you're kind of neatly making sure they're comfortable, even though they have just killed her. It's like this very conflicted way of thinking, that perhaps the killer was remorseful or emotional after having killed her, and so they tucked her in as sort of a measure to combat those emotions. But to have those kind of emotions, if you're the killer, suggests you have a real personal connection with the victim. So, Morris knew his first order of business was going to be to learn more about Sarah and the people who were close to her. And so while the crime techs continued examining the house, he sent a team of investigators to speak with Sarah's neighbors and friends to gather up some preliminary information. In the meantime, Morris and Sheriff Johnson agreed to start with the person they always started with in a crime like this, the spouse. The following day, Morris went to the nursing home where Sarah's husband lived. He wanted to inform Cardwell about what had happened to his wife, but he also wanted to see if maybe Cardwell could be a potential suspect. So he had a list of questions he wanted to ask him. But when he got to Cardwell's room and actually saw Cardwell, he knew he was not going to be able to do that, because it was immediately obvious that Cardwell was physically and mentally incapable of committing a murder. And when Morris informed him that his wife Sarah was deceased, it seemed like Cardwell didn't understand what he was saying. So Morris eventually left the nursing home and simply crossed Cardwell off the list of potential suspects. When he got back to the station, Morris headed straight to the evidence locker. He knew crime scene techs were still reviewing Sarah's home, but they had already taken a few items of interest that were now in the evidence locker. And one of those items was the colorful blanket that had been placed over Sarah. Her housekeeper had told investigators it belonged to Sarah's grandson, Mike's baby, and was usually kept in the crib at the foot of Sarah's bed. Morris at this point was convinced that Sarah's killer must have taken it from the crib and then put it on top of Sarah after they had killed her. But he needed to look over the other items too. The next thing he gravitated towards was a notebook. He put on some gloves to pick it up, and he saw that it was filled with pages and pages of handwritten lists. When he flipped through, he realized it was a daily planner, where Sarah had written all her to-do list items for each day. On the 28th of November, which was right around the time that she likely was killed, every item was crossed off. Morris realized this meant she must have lived long enough to get to the end of that day and finish her schedule. But on the next day, the 29th, none of her to-dos were crossed off. This told Morris that very likely, Sarah Dixon was killed on the night of the 28th, which was information Morris could use to check alibis when he began questioning suspects. Just then, one of the officers who had canvassed the neighborhood for witnesses entered the evidence locker to tell Morris they had some news. They said that generally, none of Sarah's neighbors had seen or heard anything suspicious. Sarah had motion sensor lights in her front yard, but no one reported ever noticing those go off in the last few nights, and no one had heard any gunshots either. As for who could have done this, Sarah was apparently very well liked and an active part of the community. Most people couldn't think of anyone who would want to hurt her. However, there was one name that came up more than once, and that was her biological son, Mike. In particular, investigators spoke to Sarah's friend Brenda, who said that Sarah openly did not like Mike's wife. And also, Sarah had recently removed her son, Mike, as her power of attorney. Now, Brenda didn't know why she had done that. I mean, maybe it had to do with her dislike of Mike's wife, but she didn't really know. But her best guess was that Sarah was mad at Mike about something. After hearing this, Morris nodded to the officer. They needed to get Mike in for questioning. Later that day, Morris and another detective walked down the precinct hallway towards an interrogation room where Mike was waiting for them. By this point, Morris had gotten the autopsy results, which were not revelatory, but they did tell him that Sarah had not just been shot once, but twice in the head at close range. One of the bullets had been found inside of Sarah's head, and the other had been found in her pillow. After testing those bullets, the investigative team determined that the gun used in her murder was a 9mm. And so all that was going to help investigator Morris when he spoke to Mike. Morris and the other detective entered the interrogation room and sat down across from Mike. Mike was a tall, lean guy with a thick mustache, and he seemed really open and ready to help. When Morris asked him about the power of attorney situation, he admitted that his mom had removed him and that he wasn't happy about it. But he said he respected her decision, and the idea that that prompted him to do this to his mom was not even close to the truth. He had nothing to do with it. He said he loved his mom and was devastated she was gone. Morris then asked Mike where he was on the 28th, the night they believed his mother was killed. And Mike said he had been at his home in Burlington with his wife, and that she would confirm this. At this point, Mike seemed like he was getting kind of impatient. He leaned forward and told Morris and the other detectives that he was not the one they should be looking at. The people they really needed to talk to were his stepbrothers, Alan and Dennis Dixon. Mike said that Alan and Dennis had a much bigger reason to be angry with Sarah than he did. Both of his stepbrothers were in line to inherit a lot of money from Cardwell's estate, but Sarah had been digging into that inheritance to pay for Cardwell's stay at the nursing home. According to Mike, it seemed like Alan and Dennis cared way more about getting the money they believed they were entitled to than making sure their father was well taken care of. Mike said that Dennis in particular was furious at Sarah for putting Cardwell in that nursing home. Mike claimed that Dennis had called Sarah and threatened her multiple times, going so far as to say he would burn her house down. Apparently, Sarah had actually changed her phone number to get Dennis to leave her alone. Now, Morris was already planning to speak with Alan and Dennis since he was investigating this as a personal crime, and Alan and Dennis were the victim's stepchildren. But these accusations Mike was throwing out were really intense, and they definitely made Morris much more interested in speaking to Cardwell's sons a lot sooner. But at the same time, Mike did have a possible motive in the fact that he was removed as power of attorney, and also there appeared to be some sort of fight going on between he and his mom that might have led to that. And also, his alibi could only be confirmed by one person, his wife. And Mike seemed really eager to point the finger at his stepbrothers, which could be a way of deflecting suspicion off of himself. But Morris didn't have any physical evidence against Mike, so for now he let him go, and instead he began looking into Alan and Dennis. That afternoon, Morris approached Dennis's house, which was just 2 doors down from Sarah's. Morris had already spent some time looking into Cardwell's other son, Alan, but he honestly didn't feel like Alan was a very strong suspect. He lived all the way in Virginia, and there was no reason to believe he'd been anywhere near Burlington on the night Sarah was murdered. So, for now, he had put Alan on the back burner and was focusing instead on Dennis. Morris knocked on Dennis's door, and a moment later, it swung open. Dennis stood in the doorway. He was a good-looking, clean-cut guy who moved with a lot of confidence. Dennis invited Morris inside, and they spoke at his kitchen table. Morris started off by asking Dennis what he'd been doing on the night of the 28th, which is believed to be the night Sarah was killed. And Dennis said he'd been home with his wife and daughter. And just like everybody else the police had spoken to so far, Dennis said he had not seen or heard anything suspicious that night, even though he lived so close by. Morris took down all this information, and then he just came out and openly confronted Dennis about the things Mike had said. Like the fact that Dennis was allegedly angry with Sarah for putting his father in a nursing home, and that apparently Dennis had threatened her over it. Dennis admitted that yes, he was mad at Sarah, because he felt like she was spending his inheritance. But he denied threatening her or being even remotely involved in any way with her murder. At this point, Morris knew that either Mike or Dennis had to be lying, because Mike was insistent that Dennis had threatened Sarah, and Dennis was insistent that that wasn't true. Still, Morris didn't know which brother was more trustworthy. They both had potential motives, and they both had weak alibis. But just like with Mike, Morris didn't have any physical evidence or anything that would allow him to arrest Dennis. So all he could do was thank Dennis for his time and walk back out to his patrol car. About a month later, on December 21st, Morris sat inside of his office at the police station, staring at Sarah's case file. He felt pressure weighing down on him, because over the past month, the police hadn't gotten a single new lead in the case. Morris had checked in with Mike and Dennis's wives, and they had both confirmed their husbands' alibis, so Morris couldn't prove that either one of them was at Sarah's house at the time of her murder. And neither Mike nor Dennis changed their story, and so even though it seemed fairly obvious one of them was lying, there wasn't any information to show who was. And so as a result of that, Morris had decided he needed to keep his mind open to other possibilities and not just get locked in on Mike and Dennis. So he'd continued to interview other people who knew Sarah, and he also had repeatedly checked in with the forensic team that was still combing through Sarah's house. But despite all that, no new information had surfaced. Meanwhile, the local community had become increasingly paranoid and upset. Sarah's murder had created a lot of fear and tension inside of Burlington, because everybody knew that whoever killed Sarah was still on the loose. So now, as Morris reviewed the case file for what felt like the 1,000th time, he was frustrated. He still felt like the crime had to be personal, but he hadn't been able to directly connect any of Sarah's family members or friends to the crime scene. The only real pieces of evidence he had were the 9mm bullets that killed Sarah, but they still had yet to find a murder weapon, and then also the tinsel that was found at her back door. And so far, no one had looked that closely at the tinsel. And so Morris decided if tinsel was all he had right now, then he needed to make the most of it. He grabbed his phone and called the county crime lab. When a tech picked up, Morris's first question was, how do you test tinsel? He didn't know if every piece of tinsel was the same, or if there was something distinctive that would allow them to differentiate one piece from another. The lab tech said they really didn't know, but told Morris to send over the evidence anyways, and they would see what they could do. So Morris hung up, then found a few of his deputies in the station, and told them they had to go do some tinsel collection while everybody in Burlington still had their decorations up. So Morris and his team went all over Burlington, going door to door, collecting every bit of tinsel they could from everybody who had it in their home. Then he sent dozens and dozens of samples to the crime lab. And for the next several months, Morris waited and waited to hear back about the tinsel, but he didn't hear a word from the crime lab. Morris felt stuck. He had a few key details, like bullets from a 9mm gun, a bright blanket draped over the victim like it was tucking her in, and a family with clearly a lot of internal conflict. But he didn't have enough information to arrest anybody. And so slowly and frustratingly, the case went cold. By February of 2009, 1 year and 3 months after Sarah was killed, her murder was no longer being actively investigated. But Morris was still thinking about it constantly. So he was ecstatic when Sheriff Johnson called him into his office and told him they needed to give Sarah's case another shot. He assigned Morris to investigate Sarah's death as a cold case and to work on it full-time along with another detective. The first thing Morris and his partner did was just to review the evidence they already had. They needed to basically refresh themselves on the details of the case. And as they were doing this, they decided that maybe the community needed a refresher too. So they ran an article about Sarah's murder in a local paper to see if maybe any new leads came from it. That article ran in April of 2009. And just 2 months after it ran, on June 2nd, a man walked into the police station, approached the reception desk, and said that he had some information about what happened to Sarah Dixon. Moments later, Morris and his partner sat the guy down inside of an interview room and asked him to introduce himself and tell them what he knew. The man said his name was Jamie Blaylock, and that for the last year and a half, he'd been keeping a terrible secret. But when he saw that article about Sarah's murder come out a couple months earlier, he decided he had to finally get this off his chest. What Jamie told Morris and his partner next was absolutely shocking, and it completely changed the way Morris thought about Sarah Dixon's murder. And it would lead to him making not just one arrest like he had anticipated, finding her killer and arresting them, but instead, Morris would make 3 arrests. But even with these 3 people now in custody, there were so many unanswered questions. That is, until Morris got some good news. The crime lab contacted the investigation team to say they had finally found a way to definitively test the tinsel found at the crime scene. And so they compared it to all the samples from the neighborhood, and they found only one was a perfect match. And when Morris heard whose home that particular now in custody, there were so many unanswered questions. That is, until Morris got some good news. The crime lab contacted the investigation team to say they had finally found a way to definitively test the tinsel found at the crime scene. And so they compared it to all the samples from the neighborhood, and they found only one was a perfect match. And when Morris heard whose home that particular sample had come from, everything clicked into place. Based on Jamie Blaylock's tip, a later confession, and also evidence collected by investigators, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Sarah Dixon on November 28, 2007. Late that night, the killer drove to Sarah's home and parked right outside of her house. But the killer wasn't alone. They had an accomplice. So the pair got out of the car, and instead of going through the front door, which again would activate the lights, they followed a very precise path around the side of the house and into the backyard. And then once they were back there, they stacked up right outside of the back door. They looked at each other and acknowledged they were ready. Then, one of them kicked open the back door. They both went straight into the house and right to Sarah's bedroom. There, without hesitation, one of them pulled out a 9mm gun wrapped in a towel to try to muffle the sound. Then they raised the gun up, aimed it at Sarah's face, and fired twice. Once Sarah was dead, the killers decided they needed to do something to cover their tracks. So they moved into the closest room, the one across the hall from Sarah's, and they messed it up as much as they could. They figured this would make it look like a robbery, and nobody would realize what this really was, a cold-blooded execution. After they were done, they left the house, got back in their car, and drove off. But later that evening, a third person entered Sarah's home. This person also came in through the back door, which by this point had been kicked open. But as they entered, they accidentally brushed up against the jagged broken door frame. and the shards of wood caught a piece of tinsel that they didn't know was stuck to their pants. This third person did not realize this had happened with the tinsel and just continued on to Sarah's bedroom. When they got there, they stood by her bed and stared at her lifeless body. Her death was what this third person had wanted and planned for, but it was still shocking to actually see it in real life. And so in a way, this third person felt really bad. And so they knew that Sarah loved her grandchildren very much, so they took her grandson's blanket from the crib at the foot of her bed and draped it over her body and tucked her in, and then they left. When Morris learned about all of this, he was shocked. Because the entire time he'd been investigating Sarah's murder, he believed it was a personal crime committed by someone who knew her well. But he'd been wrong. The truth was, the people who broke into Sarah's home and shot her were complete strangers. They were a 34-year-old man named Thomas Friday and a 19-year-old man named Matthew Fields. However, they committed this crime because the third person, the last person to go into Sarah's house after the crime, had paid them to do it. This third person did know Sarah personally. She had been like a mother to them for years, and they desperately wanted her to die. That third person was Sarah's stepson, Dennis Dixon. It would turn out Mike had been telling the truth when he said that Dennis was furious at Sarah for putting his father in a nursing home and spending the money he was supposed to inherit. But that wasn't all that Dennis was angry about. He was even more mad that Sarah and the lawyer had chosen to sell the property she lived on to continue to finance Cardwell's stay in the nursing home. Specifically because the home that Dennis lived in, that was just 2 doors down from Sarah, was actually on the 41 acres of land that she was going to sell. So, Dennis knew that if that sale went through, he, his wife, and his kids could potentially lose their home. And he decided that the only way to avoid this was to get rid of Sarah for good. When the tipster, Jamie Blaylock, had come into the police station, he'd explained that he was friends with both Dennis Dixon and Thomas Friday. And he'd said that just a few months before Sarah was murdered, he'd overheard Dennis tell Thomas that he wanted Sarah out of the picture, and he would pay someone to kill her. And once investigators had Thomas's name, they learned that he owned a 9mm pistol, which would be confirmed to be the murder weapon. Investigators also looked into Thomas and Dennis's phone records as well as bank accounts, and they were able to confirm that Dennis had promised to pay Thomas $10,000 for the murder. As for Matthew Fields' involvement, he was Thomas's ex-girlfriend's son, and Thomas had convinced him to be his accomplice in exchange for a portion of the $10,000. However, despite knowing that those two were directly involved in this murder, prosecutors were never able to conclusively prove whether it was Thomas or Matthew who actually pulled the trigger. As for the tinsel, once the crime lab was able to figure out a conclusive way to test it against other samples, they discovered that conclusively it could only have come from one place: Dennis Dixon's home. Matthew Fields was arrested, convicted of conspiracy to commit murder, and sentenced to 21 years in prison. Dennis Dixon and Thomas Friday were both found guilty of first-degree murder and received life sentences without the possibility of parole. On Sunday, September 18, 1994, Jennifer Thompson went to the county fair for the 4th day in a row. Growing up in the tiny town of Orofino, Idaho, not much usually happened. So 14-year-old Jen wasn't about to waste the most exciting days of the year. Back on Thursday, Jen and her friends had gone on all the rides from the carousel to the Ferris wheel, and then on Friday they went to the county livestock auction, and Saturday was the parade, and now on Sunday they had already watched the log cutting competition, and as they totally gorged themselves on every kind of food the fair had to offer: corn dogs, funnel cakes, cotton candy, caramel apples, and also all the soda they could drink. Now it was time to go home, and Jen was feeling completely full, like she had just eaten an entire Thanksgiving dinner. Still though, she and her friends each bought one more corn dog for the road before taking one last walk around the fairgrounds and saying their goodbyes. When Jen got home, her dad Dennis was on the phone and her mom Sherry was busy making dinner. So Jen just went upstairs to her bedroom. She had a bunch of homework she needed to finish before school on Monday. Jen liked school sports a lot more than school work, but she was in 8th grade now, and she didn't want to fall behind. So she grabbed her math assignments out of her backpack and worked on equations until her mom called her for dinner. Jen made her way downstairs and sat down at the dining room table. Her mom had made one of Jen's favorite meals, chicken and rice casserole. But after all that junk food at the county fair, Jen really didn't have an appetite. So she mostly picked at her plate and told her parents all about her day at the fair, and about how sad she was that it was now over. After dinner, Jen's mom asked Jen if she wanted any dessert, and despite her very full belly, Jen said yes. And so before long, Jen was crushing a big bowl of vanilla ice cream, and then afterwards, she helped her parents clean up before she went back upstairs to her bedroom. Once there, she finished her homework, and then just went to bed early. She wanted to be well rested for school the next day. When Jen's alarm went off in the morning, she dragged herself out of bed and shuffled into the bathroom. But when she turned on the light, a sudden sharp pain shot through her stomach. She doubled over and grabbed the bathroom counter to keep from falling down. For a second, Jen felt like she was about to throw up, but she breathed through the pain, and slowly, the cramps sort of went away. Jen released her grip on the counter and straightened up again. She stood for a moment, afraid the pain might come back, but everything seemed okay. Jen told herself that most likely she had just eaten too much at the fair and she was still feeling it today, and so she just went back to getting ready for school. After brushing her teeth, Jen got dressed and slid the math homework from last night into her backpack. Then she zipped up the bag, slung it over one shoulder, and started going downstairs. But about halfway down the steps, another sharp shooting pain cut through Jen's abdomen, and this did not feel like any sort of normal bellyache she had ever had. It felt more like something was trying to tear its way out of her stomach. Jen dropped her backpack and kind of hunched forward, clutching at her stomach. The next thing Jen knew, her mom was at the foot of the stairs, looking up at her with a mixture of confusion and concern on her face. Jen barely had time to tell her mom that she was in pain and feeling sick, before suddenly a big wave of nausea hit her, and she had to run back upstairs to the bathroom, where she vomited and also had diarrhea. A few moments later, Jen's mom, who had gone upstairs as well, knocked softly on the bathroom door and asked Jen if she was okay. Jen called out no and said she felt absolutely horrible. She said something was definitely wrong with her stomach. Through the door, Jen's mother suggested that Jen stay home from school that day. Jen was relieved, but was too nauseous to reply. When Jen's father, Dennis, got home from working at a local car dealership that evening, he went straight upstairs to check on his daughter. Sherry had told him that Jen was having a lot of stomach pain, and both parents agreed that the 4 days of crushing sugar and fried foods at the county fair was very likely responsible for this pain. But when Dennis walked into Jen's bedroom, he was shocked by how miserable she looked. Her face was red and her hair was damp with sweat. Jen told him she'd been throwing up and having diarrhea all day. Her stomach ached when she was lying down, but it hurt even worse when she was standing up. And some of the cramps were so intense, Jen said they made her cry. Dennis brushed a strand of hair out of his daughter's face, then said he was going to get her a glass of water. When he went downstairs, Sherry was waiting in the kitchen, and she would tell him that the only thing Jen had been able to stomach all day was just a few bites of ice cream, and she had been running a low-grade fever for hours. Both parents were very concerned now, but they weren't quite sure what to do. They knew their daughter absolutely hated going to the doctor, and so they agreed that, maybe now was not quite the time to take her yet. For now, Dennis and Sherry decided they would just continue giving their daughter water and Tylenol and check on her throughout the evening. Eventually, despite all her discomfort, Jen would fall asleep, and after she did, Dennis went to bed hopeful that his daughter would feel better soon. 2 days later, on Wednesday morning, Dennis got out of bed and walked upstairs to his daughter's room. But when he went inside, Jen barely stirred. She'd hardly eaten anything for 2 days, but still her stomach cramps had only gotten more painful and more frequent, and she was still running a fever, she was still vomiting, and she was still having diarrhea. Dennis knelt next to his daughter's bed and shook her shoulder until she slowly blinked awake. Then he told his daughter he had bad news. She clearly was not improving, so he and her mother had decided it was time now to go to the doctor. Jen groaned, but she didn't put up a fight, and to Dennis, this was actually a bad sign. His daughter was clearly so sick that she wasn't even trying to avoid the doctor. Dennis helped Jen get out of her bed and let her hold onto his arm for stability as they made their way down the stairs and out to the car. Then Dennis backed out of the driveway and headed to their usual family medicine clinic. A few minutes later, Dennis helped Jen climb onto an exam table, and he could tell she was struggling just to sit upright. Before long, Jen's longtime pediatrician, Lyndon Bishop, came into the room, and he was surprised to see his athletic young patient looking so ill. He listened closely as Dennis explained his daughter's symptoms, and all the while, Jen just silently sat there, clutching her stomach and leaning forward. Dennis told Dr. Bishop that he was pretty sure his daughter had food poisoning from something she must have eaten at the county fair. But when the doctor gave Jen a quick physical examination, he said that he thought Dennis was actually wrong, that this was something else. Because he said, food poisoning usually only lasts for 1 to 2 days, and Jen had been in pain for over 3 days. And so Dennis was taken aback by this, but he understood the logic. Dr. Bishop asked Jen if she had any history of stomach pain. Her father was about to answer for her, but then Jen lifted her symptoms like a fever, diarrhea, and vomiting. But Dr. Bishop said he did think it was possible. Maybe Jen was ovulating, and that caused the swelling to return, and her symptoms came back even worse than before. It was the best and really only theory they had for now. So Jen was ultimately sent home with strict instructions to come back if the pain got any worse. Dennis was disappointed there wasn't more they could do for the moment, but he trusted Dr. Bishop's judgment, so he helped Jen off the exam table and walked her back out to the car. He leaned the passenger seat all the way back so Jen could lie down, and then as they drove home, Jen curled into the fetal position and began moaning. It made Dennis feel terrible to see his daughter suffer so badly when he really couldn't do anything to help her. But he reminded himself what Dr. Bishop had said right before they left. Don't worry, Jen will feel better soon. Later that evening, Dennis tucked his shivering daughter into bed. Sherry had gone out of town to visit the couple's other daughter. Dennis was going to be holding down the fort by himself along with Jen, and so far everything seemed to be okay. At least Jen was resting. Dennis put on his pajamas, brushed his teeth, and climbed into bed to watch TV, but as soon as he turned it on, he heard his daughter screaming, so he jumped out of bed and sprinted to Jen's room. When he got there, he found his daughter lying on the floor, curled up into a ball with tears streaming down her face. Jen kept screaming that she'd never felt anything that hurt this badly. She said she literally felt like she was going to die. In a total panic, Dennis ran back downstairs to the living room. He grabbed the phone and called the nearest emergency room. A receptionist answered and patched him through to a nurse, and Dennis explained what was happening, and the nurse paged Dr. Bishop, and he responded immediately, saying, "You know what? It sounds like Jen has appendicitis." The nurse told Dennis to bring his daughter to the emergency room immediately. In severe appendicitis cases, the appendix can burst open inside the body, causing complications and even death. And so if Jen had acute appendicitis, then she would need surgery to remove her appendix as soon as possible. By the time they made it to the hospital about 20 minutes later, Jen was barely coherent. Dennis lifted her out of the passenger seat and carried her into the emergency room. Under the bright fluorescent lights, he could see that his daughter's face was bright red and drenched in sweat. As soon as Dennis approached the check-in desk with his daughter in his arms, the receptionist called for the nurse who he'd spoken to on the phone. Within moments, the nurse and other members of the hospital staff loaded Jen onto a gurney, and Dennis followed as they wheeled his daughter into a nearby exam room. The nurse began taking Jen's vital signs and saw that she had a fever, she was severely dehydrated, and her pulse was distressingly high. The nurse began to explain to Dennis what his daughter's vital signs could mean, but then a short man wearing glasses and a white coat entered the room. He introduced himself as Dr. Maurice Mazer, and he'd already been briefed up on Jen's condition, so he went straight to her bedside and began examining her. He began to press lightly on the lower right-hand side of Jen's abdomen to check her appendix. The doctor's prodding seemed to wake Jen up, and she began to cry out in pain and tried to push the doctor away. Dr. Mazer said that it did look like Jen had appendicitis. This would explain her extreme abdominal pain, her fever, and her confusion. The doctor said the only treatment was an emergency operation to remove her appendix, like right now. But as Dr. Mazer reviewed Jen's medical charts, he told her father that something didn't look right to him. Jen's white blood cell count, her body's natural defense, was going down. The doctor said the number of those cells should be soaring right now as Jen's body fought off this appendicitis. Dr. Mazur said the drop could mean two things. Either her infection was getting better, which seemed very unlikely based on how sick Jen still appeared, or her appendicitis was getting so severe that it was overwhelming her natural defenses. And so Dr. Mazur told Dennis that bottom line, he believed Jen's appendix needed to be removed immediately. Otherwise, his daughter's life could be in danger. Dennis looked at Jen, who looked absolutely terrified. Tears filled her eyes as she said she didn't want to have surgery. But all Dennis could do was promise her that she would feel better when it was all over. And then he gave his daughter a gentle hug before the nurses took her away to be prepped for surgery. Jen's mother, Sherry, returned from visiting her other daughter just in time to find Dennis sitting in the hospital waiting room. The couple spent the next hour waiting on the edge of their seats until finally Dr. Mazur entered the waiting room and sat down beside them. Right away, the doctor said Jen's surgery had gone smoothly and she was okay, but then Dr. Mazur frowned. He explained that while Jen's appendix did show modest signs of infection, it wasn't nearly bad enough to cause the agony she had been going through. The parents were confused. Their daughter had been rushed into emergency surgery to remove her appendix, but now that that was done, it sounded like it might not have been necessary. But Dr. Mazur, who was sensing this in the parents, assured them that they'd actually done the right thing, because during the course of this operation, Dr. Mazur had discovered something very unsettling about Jen. Jen's whole intestinal tract looked red and inflamed, and Dr. Mazur didn't know why. And so, in short, because of this operation, it was discovered that Jen's appendix was not badly infected. However, the rest of her digestive system was. And so Dr. Mazur said he hoped Jen would feel better now that her appendix was out, but he just wasn't sure if that had really done anything to fix the issue. Dennis and Sherry turned to each other in amazement. Neither of them were comforted by the idea that Jen might or might not feel better. It sounded like she had a dangerous infection that the surgery hadn't really touched. But there was nothing they could do about that now, so Dennis grabbed a magazine off the waiting room table and began to read, doing his best to distract himself until he could see his daughter again. "1,200 miles away at that very moment, a different and yet eerily similar story was playing out in rural Minnesota. A young nurse named Callie Vins was working in a small local medical clinic, and it was totally packed. Normally, it was not her job to check patients in, but there were so many people crammed into the small waiting room that the receptionist needed Callie's help. Callie pushed her short dark hair out of her face, feeling totally overwhelmed. She was an experienced and highly capable nurse, but the past few days had really pushed her to her limit. Dozens of teenagers had come into the clinic with fevers, diarrhea, vomiting, and extreme stomach pains. One of the doctors who worked at this clinic thought the teenagers had the flu, but to Callie, that didn't make any sense. For starters, if this was the flu, then why were only teenagers getting sick? Why not their parents or younger siblings? And why didn't they have runny noses, coughs, or any of the other respiratory symptoms typically associated with the flu? Callie heard the bell above the front door ring as yet another nauseous teenager and their parents stepped inside. Looking around at the waiting room full of sick kids, Callie knew she needed to do something. Whatever was going on here, she did not believe their small clinic was equipped to handle it. Callie turned and told the receptionist that she'd be right back. Then Callie made her way through the crowd of people and into the back of the clinic. At the nurse's station, she pulled out the office phone book and found the number for the Minnesota Department of Health. As soon as a representative answered her call, Callie described the mysterious outbreak in her small rural town. The representative told Callie to collect saliva, urine, and stool samples from all the patients and send them in to the health department for testing. This way, state analysts could try to figure out what was causing this widespread illness. Callie thanked the official and then hung up the phone. As one of the clinic's doctors rushed past her on the way to visit yet another patient, Callie pulled them aside and explained what they needed to do. A couple days later, 14-year-old Jen Thompson was back at home in Orofino, Idaho, lying on the living room couch and watching TV. She'd been released from the hospital, but so far, recovering from her appendectomy had been very difficult. The incision on her lower abdomen was always itchy, her stomach ached constantly, and she could barely keep food down. Plus, on top of that, she'd never been so bored in her life. It had only been a little over a week since she got sick, but she already just felt so isolated. She missed going to softball practice and spending time with her friends. She even missed school, which was something she never thought she'd say. Jen picked up the TV remote and began flipping through the channels trying to find something she wanted to watch. But then suddenly, this sharp, totally overwhelming pain filled her stomach, and it was so intense it made her drop the remote. The pain she was having felt just like the cramps she had had before her surgery. Jen's bottom lip started to tremble. She called out for her dad, and a second later, Dennis rushed into the room. Jen was in so much pain she could barely breathe, let alone talk. But as soon as Dennis walked into the room, she really didn't have to explain anything to him. He could see clearly how much pain his daughter was in, and so a second later he had ran out of the room, got Jen's mother, and got the car keys, and then within minutes, the entire Thompson family was back on the road, heading to the hospital. Less than an hour later, Jen was lying on a hospital bed with Dr. Mazur standing over her. Dr. Mazur pressed lightly on Jen's abdomen and said her incision seemed to be healing fine. But clearly, something other than appendicitis was making her sick. Dr. Mazur said he was beginning to wonder if maybe Jen was suffering from an infection that was inside of her intestines. So he ordered a stool sample to be tested for a number of different bacteria. The idea of foreign bacteria inside her digestive tract really freaked Jen out. But it wasn't nearly as bad as what Dr. Mazur said next. Bacterial testing would likely take at least 24 hours to complete, and he didn't think they had any time to waste. Dr. Mazur was worried that he'd missed something along the way, so he suggested an exploratory surgery to see if he might be able to determine the source of her illness. Jen had already gone through one surgery, and the idea of being cut open again was almost too much for her to handle. She looked at her parents, wishing they could save her from this. Her mother looked like she was about to cry, while her father was just shaking his head back and forth. But Dennis told the doctor that if another surgery was what they had to do, then that's what they had to do. And deep down, even though Jen did not want to do this surgery, she knew he was right. So, despite Jen's deep anxieties, nurses began prepping her for the operation. They hooked her up to an IV and then cleaned the skin on her belly where the scalpel would cut her open. All the while, Jen felt like she was going to throw up, both from nerves and also from her illness. But just as the nurses were about to wheel Jen back into the operating room, Dr. Mazur came running into the room saying the surgery would not be necessary after all. The hospital lab was not very busy that day, so they'd been able to expedite the stool sample tests, and now he knew the source of Jen's illness. It would turn out Jen's illness was not from her enlarged ovary or from appendicitis. The doctor said she had a potentially deadly microorganism living inside her digestive tract. Now, it most likely came from something she ate, but the doctor said he had no idea what that could be. However, on the positive side, Dr. Mazur said that, while this microorganism was very dangerous, there was a very effective treatment that they could begin right away. As Jen's treatment began, 3 states away, a man named Larry Edmondson was standing in his office at the Minnesota Department of Health, staring at a large map that he'd taped up on his wall. It was a detailed picture of the state of Minnesota, and Larry had stuck a number of red thumbtacks into the map to mark different locations. Larry was leading the investigation into the mysterious disease outbreak in his state. After nurse Callie Vins had called the Minnesota Health Department, Larry and his team had received dozens of biological samples from patients at Callie's clinic. They tested each one, and they too discovered the source of the outbreak. It was the same microorganism that infected Jen in Idaho. But Larry didn't know about Jen. He thought the microorganism was only in Minnesota, and right now he was trying to figure out exactly where it came from. The Minnesota Health Department had continued receiving calls from medical clinics across the state, reporting patients with similar symptoms. Every time Larry got a call, he would send a representative to interview the sick patient and also to collect samples of anything they'd eaten recently. Then Larry put a red thumbtack on the patient's location on the map. He had hoped these red thumbtacks would be more concentrated in one particular area, allowing him to sort of pinpoint the origin of the disease outbreak. But the thumbtacks were spread out in a way that looked totally random. Larry didn't know what to make of this, but he knew that with each passing day, more people were getting sick. While Larry Edmondson puzzled over the Minnesota outbreak, representatives from the Idaho went over to them to see what they were talking about. He knew that each of these petri dishes contained a swab from the food samples that the health department had collected. The lab analysts were watching all of them for signs of this microorganism, and all of these samples currently looked normal, except for one, which had grown a whole bunch of small black circles all over the sample. Larry's eyes widened when he saw it, because those black circles were a telltale sign of this deadly microorganism. He asked the analysts which food that sample came from, and they said it was from ice cream. Larry quickly reviewed the records from his investigation, and the truth dawned on him. Every person who had fallen ill had recently eaten ice cream from a company called Schwann's. And now the health department had proof that this ice cream contained this deadly microorganism. Larry almost wanted to cheer, but he reminded himself that this was not really a time to celebrate. He was sure that the company Schwann's had no idea their ice cream was poisoning people, so Larry would have to call them right away. A few days later, Larry sat in his office at the Minnesota Health Department feeling very frustrated. This case just kept getting more difficult. When Larry had called the ice cream company Schwann's, he learned something very concerning. Schwann's ice cream was not typically sold in grocery stores. Instead, it was delivered directly to customers' doors all across the United States. Now, Larry still knew nothing about 14-year-old Jen Thompson's severe illness out in Idaho, but he now understood that this disease outbreak likely went far beyond Minnesota. On the bright side, though, Schwann's had been extremely cooperative. As soon as they learned their ice cream was tainted, they shut down their factory and recalled all of the potentially contaminated products. Schwann's delivery drivers were going door to door across the nation, informing customers of this outbreak and collecting tainted ice cream. But the Minnesota Health Department still hadn't figured out how the microorganism got into the ice cream in the first place. And that was the only way to prevent this disaster from happening again. Larry read over a report from one of his colleagues. They had swabbed miles of stainless steel piping at the company's giant manufacturing plant, but none contained any trace of this microorganism that sickened all the teens. So where was it coming from? Minnesota officials had expanded their investigation to include the company's distribution system, and so Larry's coworkers were now analyzing the company's trucks, trying to see if maybe the product was contaminated during shipping. Just then, Larry's phone rang, and he picked it up, hoping it would be one of his colleagues with good news. But it wasn't. When Larry answered, he heard a man's nervous voice, and this man said he had a tip about the department's ongoing food safety investigation, but this man was calling from a payphone because he wanted to stay anonymous. When Larry heard this, he sat upright, pressing the phone hard against his ear. He told the man that was fine. Larry didn't need his name, he just needed whatever information he had. So the man whispered that he was a truck driver, and the company he worked for shipped two kinds of cargo: bulk ice cream for Schwann's and unpasteurized liquid eggs. The driver said that the same trucks could carry liquid eggs one day and ice cream the next. And then in between, the refrigerated cargo tanks on the back of the trucks were supposed to be thoroughly cleaned so that there was no contamination from one load to the next. But the tipster said one driver had not been given the right cleaning supplies to disinfect their vehicle after hauling thousands of gallons of liquid eggs, so bacteria from the unpasteurized eggs contaminated the entire truck. And so as soon as the Schwann's ice cream was loaded into that truck, the ice cream got contaminated. Larry thanked the driver for coming forward. Because of him, the Minnesota Health Department could finally close this case. Larry immediately went to his supervisors and told them the whole story. When that cargo truck wasn't cleaned properly, it turned into a giant incubator for a type of deadly bacteria found in unpasteurized eggs called Salmonella. The Salmonella bacteria then mixed with a giant shipment of Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so after 14-year-old Jen Thompson got home from the county fair on Sunday, February 18th, 1994, she did her math homework, she ate her dinner, then right before bed, she ate a bowl of the contaminated Schwann's vanilla ice cream. And so, of course, she and her parents had no idea that her dessert was full of Salmonella bacteria. And so as a result, Jen just kept eating more and more of this contaminated ice cream each time she felt sick, because it was really the only food she could actually stomach. And so as this bacteria continued to multiply inside of her body, she got sicker and sicker. Jen and her family had no idea the ice cream was behind her illness until sometime in mid-October, when a Schwann's delivery driver came to their door and asked to take the contaminated ice cream back. The Schwann's salmonella contamination was one of the biggest mass poisonings in American history. In total, there were 593 confirmed cases of salmonella poisoning across 41 states and as many as 5,000 suspected cases nationwide. However, some experts estimate that there may have been nearly 225,000 people who got sick from this tainted ice cream. They just didn't report it. The ice cream company, Schwann's, paid out thousands of settlements to victims and changed their shipping procedure to make sure this contamination could never happen again. As for why the illness predominantly struck teenagers, it was likely due to two factors. One, young people tend to eat more ice cream, and two, young people tend to be more shy or embarrassed to talk about gastrointestinal issues than their more senior counterparts. And so as a result, maybe they began having symptoms and could have gone to the doctor and dealt with them, but in fear of being embarrassed, they didn't go to the doctor and let this condition get worse and worse and worse, and then finally it turned into a full-blown emergency room visit. But very few of the people who got salmonella poisoning had symptoms as severe as 14-year-old Jen Thompson. Even after having her appendix removed, she had to undergo at least 3 more surgeries to fix her damaged digestive system, including having her gallbladder taken out. The salmonella also caused her to develop a rare type of arthritis. To this day, Jen still lives with chronic pain, all because of a few bowls of ice cream she ate back in 1994.
On the afternoon of June 15, 1988, a man named Keith Reinard drove down the main street of a tiny town called Silver Plume, which is located in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. In his car was everything Keith would need to live for the next 3 months. Silver Plume was the kind of place that most people would just pass by on the highway without even considering stopping. It was kind of a no-name town in the middle of nowhere. In the 1800s, it had been a booming mining town. However, now all but 140 of its residents had either died or moved away. In fact, Silver Plume was considered a living ghost town because of how close it was to being totally abandoned. But this emptiness and kind of middle of nowhere-ness was exactly what appealed to Keith about this town. Keith was 49 years old and lived over 1,000 miles away to the east in a suburb of Chicago, Illinois. And Keith had a great life. He was married with 2 kids, a boy and a girl. He had a good job working for a newspaper covering high school sports, and he had a beautiful house. But for Keith, he felt like as good as his life looked on paper, it was missing something. There was one thing he had always wanted to do, but had always put off doing, and that was to write a book. And not just any book, a book that lots of people were going to read, a great American classic. That's what he wanted to make. But there was just one problem. Keith had no idea what this big book was going to be about, and that was why he had come to Silver Plume. Keith had taken a 3-month leave from his job and left his wife and his kids and the city all behind to come out to this town to hopefully, in this new, peaceful, quiet environment, find the inspiration he really needed to not only discover what this book would be about, but to sit down and actually write it. Keith's wife had not been happy about this plan, him kind of being gone for 3 months, not providing any income, not helping with the kids. But she could tell Keith really felt like he needed to do this, and so she gave him her blessing. After arriving on Main Street in Silver Plume, Keith looked up and he saw KP Cafe off to the right. It was a weathered old building that looked like it was straight out of a cowboy movie, and this cafe was exactly the landmark that Keith had been looking for. And so he pulled his car over on the side of the road, he got out, he stretched, and then he began walking towards this cafe. This cafe was the big hangout spot in Silver Plume for all of its 140 residents, and the reason Keith knew this was because his best friend from high school, Ted Parker, owned KP Cafe. Ted had actually been the person who inspired Keith to come to Silver Plume in the first place. He had told him about how peaceful and serene this place was, the best environment for a writer. And when Keith had told Ted that sounds great, I'm going to do it, I'm going to come to Silver Plume, Ted had told him that he also owned the store right next to KP Cafe. It used to be a bookstore, but the previous tenant who ran the bookstore had talked about some big European vacation he was going on and then had just kind of vanished. And so for months now, this storefront had been vacant. And so Ted had told Keith that while he was in town, he was more than welcome to work and write out of this vacant bookshop. And so Keith, after walking up to the front window of KP Cafe, he looked inside and didn't see Ted, and so he decided he would take a moment and walk over to this vacant bookshop that would be his office. So he went next door, he pulled out the key that Ted had already sent him in advance, he unlocked the door, and he went inside. And right away, Keith was struck at what he saw. I mean, the place was full of books. Some piles of books were higher than his head, and many of the books looked rare and expensive. And Keith's first thought was, why did this guy who used to run this store just abandon all of this? This had to cost a lot of money. But Keith was far too excited about the next few months and getting this book done that he didn't really think too hard about whatever the previous owner had done. And instead, he just began to daydream about what the next few months would be like and how this book was going to turn out. And as Keith was thinking about his big book project, Ted actually came into the bookstore, and when the two friends saw each other, they ran up to each other and embraced, and then before long, the two of them had gone outside and began walking around Silver Plume, just chatting and catching up. And eventually, after chatting and walking around for a really long time, the pair left Silver Plume and wound up walking onto this hiking trail that went up into the woods. Now, years earlier, Ted and Keith had both been avid hikers and outdoorsmen, but now, Keith had put on some weight and he really wasn't a big hiker anymore, but Ted didn't really know that. And so Ted, he's leading this hike up this trail as they're still kind of chatting and making light of things. But Keith, as he was struggling to keep up, was getting more and more anxious about this hike, and he also had a deep fear of heights, and this trail appeared to go really high up this mountain. But Keith kept telling himself that, he was here in Silver Plume as much to write this book as he was to kind of have a little more adventure in his life. And so he just kept on trudging along after Ted. But eventually, Keith just could not handle how high up they were getting. He was totally terrified of being able to see the valley way down below. And so he had a sort of panic attack where he lunged and grabbed a nearby tree and hugged it like it was the only thing keeping him from falling off the mountain. And when Ted turned around and saw Keith, he rushed over to him and said, "Don't worry, everything is okay." He convinced him to let go of the tree, and then very carefully, Keith and Ted walked back down the trail back into town. And when they got down there, Ted would tell Keith he was so sorry for putting Keith in such a stressful position, and Keith kind of brushed it off and said, it's totally fine, no big deal. Even though this panic attack was very embarrassing for Keith, he wound up just kind of shifting his mental focus to getting settled into this new life he was going to be living for the next few months. And so along with this office space in this old abandoned bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town. Bookstore that Keith would be using, he also rented a small apartment in the little church in town, and very quickly, Keith developed a sort of daily routine. He would get up early in his apartment, and he would make his way over to the bookstore, and he would sit down at his computer, and he would write all day. But even though Keith was doing a lot of writing, it was not productive writing. It was mostly Keith sitting down, trying to come up with the topic for his book, not being able to do it, and then he just sort of drifted off and began doing journal entries and writing snippets of poetry, and then before long the day was over and he had accomplished nothing. And so at the end of June, roughly 2 weeks after Keith had arrived in town, he was sitting at his computer one morning inside of the bookshop, unable to write anything productive, and he told himself, I gotta do something to break out of this writer's block. Writer's block is when writers kind of hit a psychological wall and just can't seem to be creative. They can't write. And so Keith decided, in order to kind of get out of this funk, that he would go back up into the mountains again. He would face his fear of heights, and he would get to the summit, and that clean mountain air and all the nature around him would kind of bring him back to reality and give him the inspiration he would need to just write this book. And so Keith turned off his computer, he left the bookstore, he went back to his apartment in the church, he packed some sandwiches and some water into a backpack, and then he walked from the church apartment to the nearby trail that would lead out of Silver Plume and up into the forest and into the mountains. It was a hot day that day, but as soon as Keith was underneath the shade of all the trees, it was very cool, and the sounds of the birds and the insects and other animals all around him was very calming. But very quickly, Keith's hike went from very peaceful and relatively flat to very intimidating and very steep. But Keith, he was determined to do this hike. He felt like it was a critical step in the creation of this book. And so he just kept on going one foot after another, huffing and panting and making his way up this incredibly steep trail. And it was like with every step he took, he felt braver and braver, and suddenly he was able to look down at the valley below and not feel as frightened. And then at some point, as he was walking up, he saw all these scratch marks on a tree that were obviously from a mountain lion. But instead of Keith feeling scared, he felt more brave. He felt excited. He felt like this is what he came here for. This book and adventure kind of coming together in this moment. Finally, Keith made it to the top of this trail, and he found this incredible clearing that looked down over the town below. And in this clearing was a monument to a man named Clifford Griffin, who had died at this exact spot 100 years earlier. Keith knew Clifford's story. Back in 1887, when Silver Plume was a booming mining town, Clifford, who was a mine owner, came up to this exact spot in the mountains to play his violin. And then after playing it for a bit, he stopped and dug a grave, stood on the edge of it, shot himself, and fell into the hole. No one knew why he did that, but within a couple of years, the mining industry came to a halt in Silver Plume and everybody just kind of vanished. And very quickly, rumors began to swirl around the people who remained in Silver Plume, how, their town must be cursed. And maybe it was connected to what happened to poor old Clifford. After staring at this monument for a few minutes, Keith turned his attention to lunch. He pulled up his backpack, took out a sandwich, and he began eating. And as he ate, he looked back at this monument, and he thought of another strange Silver Plume story, except this one hit much closer to home. It was about the man who used to run the bookstore where Keith now did all of his writing out of. This man's name was Tom Young, and it would turn out what Keith had heard about Tom when Keith first arrived in Silver Plume was not entirely correct. Keith had been told that Tom had been talking about this European vacation, and so the consensus was that, he had left town and gone to Europe and just not come back. But the reality was, once Keith began asking around a little bit over those first couple of weeks he was there, was that Tom actually had been talking about this big European vacation, but then had walked into the woods up into the mountains, where Keith was right now, where this monument was, and Tom had just vanished, apparently, in these mountains. Tom apparently had been a very quirky guy who had come to Silver Plume in the 1970s to kind of start a new life for himself. He had been teaching high school students in Denver, but he apparently didn't really like doing that and wanted to start over, and so that was what drew him to Silver Plume. And in Silver Plume, residents always saw Tom, along with his best friend, Gus, his black Labrador retriever, walking around town playing fetch. But instead of using a ball, Tom would throw a chewed-up doll's head. And then, on September 7th, 1987, so roughly 9 months before Keith arrived in Silver Plume, Tom and his dog Gus had gone for a hike in the woods where Keith was, and then vanished. Now, at first, people assumed that because Tom had been talking a lot about going on this European vacation right before he vanished, that must be where he went. But when people checked his shop, they saw all of his books were still in there. It did not appear like he had packed things up. And when the sheriff looked into it, he couldn't find any evidence that Tom had ever bought any plane tickets to go to Europe. And so no one really knew what happened to Tom. It was like this big mystery. And so as Keith was standing in this clearing near this monument, thinking about Tom and his story, Keith began to realize there were a lot of similarities between him, Keith, and Tom. They both, as adults, had come to Silver Plume, this kind of random place in the middle of Colorado, to get a sort of second chance in life. And they both worked out of the exact same storefront. And Keith had done some additional digging on Tom when he heard about this mystery and learned that they were almost the exact same age. Their birthdays were separated by 1 day. Also, Keith discovered that he and Tom had served in the military at almost the exact same time in the 1960s. And so as Keith was going over all these strange coincidences and weird similarities between his life and Tom's, suddenly Keith stopped chewing his sandwich and just quickly packed everything back up. He turned and began running down the trail, going back towards town. And as he ran, Keith smiled because he realized he had just discovered what his great American classic novel was going to be about. It was going to be about Tom. For the entire month of July, all Keith did was write. He was in his office 7 days a week typing away, and then at night when he went back to his apartment, his neighbors would see the lights on all night long. At the end of July, so by this point Keith has been living in Silver Plume for about a month and a half, 2 hunters from Silver Plume began hiking up that same mountain trail that led up into the mountains and into the forest that Keith had gone on recently and found his inspiration for his novel. And so these 2 hunters, they're making their way up the trail, and at some point they leave the marked trail and begin kind of meandering through the trees. And as they're walking, they're kind of looking for a clearing to set up for the day. And at one point, one of the hunters happens to look up and he sees there's this really bright white thing sitting at the base of a tree in a clearing. And so these 2 hunters make their way up to this bright white thing, and as soon as they're looking down at it, they realize they have very likely stumbled on a crime scene. At their feet was this green tarp that was partially exposing this white skeleton underneath. And when they pulled back the green tarp a little bit, they saw it was a human skeleton and a dog skeleton kind of lying next to each other as if the 2 of them had lied down and died there. But what was immediately apparent to these 2 hunters is that both the human skull and the dog skull had gaping holes in them, like they had been shot. And several feet away from the skeletons was a rusted pistol. And so these 2 hunters, after staring at the scene in front of them for a couple of seconds, they took a mental note of where they were on the mountain, and then they turned around and headed back down to town to tell the sheriff. And when the sheriff went up with his deputies to go search the scene themselves, they very quickly identified that these remains belonged to Tom Young and his dog Gus. And the sheriff also found out that that pistol that was found several feet away from the 2 skeletons had been purchased by Tom just a few days before he had vanished. And so the sheriff decided that what must have happened is Tom brought his dog up into the mountains, and after shooting his dog, Tom turned and shot himself. This was a suicide. Case closed. But this explanation didn't make any sense to the people of Silver Plume. First of all, Tom loved his dog Gus. Gus was basically like his child because Tom didn't have any other family, and so why would he hurt his dog? Also, Tom was not acting remotely like someone who was going to commit suicide in the days leading up to his death. People saw him at the grocery store buying a whole bunch of groceries. He talked endlessly about how excited he was about this big European vacation. And then there was this one other thing that also made suicide seem very unlikely. When those 2 hunters had discovered Tom and Gus, they were partially covered by that green plastic tarp. But it looked very much like the wind and kind of nature in general had blown the tarp off of them, revealing the white bones that the hunters had seen. But what that meant is that very likely that tarp at one point had been totally covering their bodies. And so between that and the fact that the gun was located several feet away from where Tom was, it seemed to the people of Silver Plume that probably somebody else had shot and killed both Tom and Gus, covered them up with this tarp, and then dumped the gun several feet away. Adding to the theory that this was a murder, not a suicide, were the rumors around town that there was this nuclear weapon production facility somewhere near their town, and apparently they were illegally dumping radioactive materials into these old abandoned mine shafts near and in Silver Plume. And people thought, maybe Tom, who had military training, he was actually in the special forces in the military, maybe he had gone out and done some snooping around and discovered this illegal dumping operation, and that got him killed. When Keith heard that Tom and Gus's bodies had been discovered up in the mountains, it was absolutely devastating for Keith. Even though Keith had never actually met Tom, he still felt like he had a bond with Tom. I mean, he was obsessively writing about Tom and learning everything about him, and he also had all these similarities with Tom, and so it was a really big deal to find out that Tom and Gus were dead. But the silver lining to this tragedy was that Keith was now armed with more information about Tom and his dog, and suddenly the ending to his big novel became clear. And so Keith got right back to work. On August 3rd, 1988, so a couple of days after Tom and Gus's skeletons were found up in the mountains, the town of Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment. And when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel. And he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. Silver Plume held a memorial service for Tom. And Keith, he would attend this service, and as he listened to the people of Silver Plume talking about Tom and how he had come to Silver Plume to get this second chance at life, Keith couldn't help but feel like it was almost like he was watching his own memorial service because Tom's life so closely mirrored his own. And then, as he was listening to more and more people talk, Keith started to feel like there was no way Tom killed himself. That can't be what happened. Something else happened to Tom. And Keith was confident that through his research and through doing this book about Tom, he would figure out what happened to him and his dog. As soon as the memorial service ended, Keith quickly slipped out and headed back to his apartment. And when he went inside, he looked around at all the stacks of papers and maps and books that he was using to put together this novel. And he knew that out of all this chaos around him, this novel really was becoming a thing. He was doing it. He was gonna get this book done. But he knew there was one more thing he had to do before he could finish this book. And that was, he had to go back up into the mountains. So, a few days later, on August 7th, at around 4:30 in the afternoon, Keith walked inside of KP Cafe and strolled up to the counter where his buddy, Ted Parker, was sitting there reading a book. Keith paid for a drink and then announced to Ted that he, Keith, was going to leave this cafe and go right up into the mountains again. And so as Keith told Ted his big plan for this hike he was going to go on, Ted just felt totally confused. Ted's looking at Keith knowing this guy is not a confident climber. I mean, they had gone on that one hike partway up the mountain, and Keith had had a panic attack and had to go back down again. Also, at the top of the mountain, it was like 12,000 feet of elevation where the temperatures would be near or below freezing, and here Keith was just wearing a flannel shirt and jeans. He had no other equipment with him, no other warm clothes. Also, the route that Keith was describing to Ted would take at least 6 hours round trip, and it's 4:30 p.m. now. And so Ted's thinking, Keith is going to get trapped up in the mountains in the middle of the night. And so Ted finally says to Keith, "I hope you're joking." But Keith would say, I am not joking, and in fact, I'm leaving right now. And then before Ted could even protest, Keith turned around and while sipping his drink, just casually walked out of the store and began heading towards the mountains. And Ted, he thought about stopping Keith and really talking some sense into him and getting him not to do this hike. But ultimately, Ted decided to do nothing, and he told himself that he would just check on Keith the next day. And so, the next morning, Ted, instead of going to his cafe, went first to the bookstore next door to see if Keith was in there. But when he got to the door, it was clear Keith was not inside, and the door was locked, and everything was dark. And so, trying not to panic, Ted hopped right back into his car, and he drove over to the church apartment where Keith had been staying. But again, Keith was not there. And right away, Ted is like, oh my goodness, Keith is stuck up on the mountain right now. Exactly what I thought was going to happen has happened. And so right away, Ted rushed to the sheriff to tell him that Keith was missing. And after hearing what Ted had to say, the sheriff would end up launching one of the biggest search and rescue efforts in the history of Colorado. Within 24 hours of being informed of Keith's absence, there were hundreds of people, professional searchers, and just locals who wanted to help, combing this mountain trail looking for Keith. There were planes overhead, there were tracking dogs. I mean, this was a really big deal. And by this point, Keith was very well known in Silver Plume. It's a tiny place. Everybody knows each other, and everyone knew that, he was working on this big book. And so people were really worried about Keith. He was one of theirs. But also, the townspeople were very creeped out by the fact that, Keith, who they knew was very similar to Tom, they knew he was writing about Tom, they knew that Keith was working out of the same storefront that Tom had been in, that now Keith had apparently vanished under the exact same circumstances as Tom. He had wandered into the woods, and that was it. And so it just felt like, how could they have these two people go missing in the exact same way? It just wasn't adding up. On August 9th, so 2 days after Keith had gone missing, and so by this point he's still missing, Ted and some friends decided they would go to Keith's apartment and look around and see if maybe there was some clue as to where Keith went or what he was going to do on this hike. And so they went into his apartment, and Ted's friends began fanning out and looking in the bedroom and looking through all the papers and documents all over the floor, and Ted sat down at Keith's computer. And so Ted fired it up. And as soon as it loaded, there was just this one document on the desktop, and it was the book that Keith was writing. And so Ted clicked on it. And right away, after reading just a couple of lines, he was yelling for his friends to come over here and look at this. And one by one, each of these guys came over and they just could not believe what they were looking at. From the first page of Keith's book, it was clear the setting for his book was Silver Plume. Except he renamed it White Plume. He had created all these fictional characters as well that were obviously based on real people, but had renamed them as well. But that was not what shocked Ted and his friends. What shocked them was the main character of this book. His name was Guy Gypsum. Guy Gypsum was a military veteran who had come to White Plume looking for a better life and an opportunity to be closer to nature in rural Colorado. Guy was almost 50 years old, he loved to go hiking, and he worked out of a storefront that was right next to the only cafe in town. Guy Gypsum was both Keith and Tom at the same time. Keith basically had taken Tom's life and Keith's own life and merged them to create this composite character. And when Ted and his friends scrolled to the bottom of this document, they realized that Keith had written an ending for Guy Gypsum's character. These are the final words in this document. Guy Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now, and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forests above. 5 days later, the search for Keith was called off. He was never found. Some people say Keith wandered up into the mountains and accidentally died of exposure, and someday we'll find his remains somewhere in the forest. But others say, after reading that final line in Keith's book, that Keith did all this on purpose. I mean, he literally lived out the final part of his book. He put on his boots and his heavy flannel shirt and his jeans, and he wandered off into the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above and killed himself in order to perhaps get closer to Tom Young, the man he had kind of become obsessed with after learning they were so similar, and the man he kind of like meshed his own life with and created this weird composite character of these two lives. I mean, it seemed like a guy that had kind of spiraled into madness in writing this book and decided that death was the only way to finish the novel. And still others say, maybe there really is some kind of secret illicit operation happening in or around Silverplume. Maybe it's that radioactive waste getting dumped into the mines that, Tom discovered and that got him killed. And Keith, in researching Tom, also discovered this illegal thing and that got Keith killed as well. But all of those things are just theories because today, officially, there is no answer as to what happened to Keith. His case is still open.
Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. Those are Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Run Fool. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you will find all of them. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the one you listened to today, but in video format on our YouTube channel. And our YouTube channel is just called Mr. Ballen. Go check it out. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.